At the request of the Broadcasting and Recording Service, members and visitors in the public gallery are requested to ensure that for the duration of the meeting their mobile phones are turned off completely or switched to airplane safe or flight mode depending on their device. It is not sufficient just to put phones on silent mode, as they will maintain a level of interference with the broadcasting system. Item number 6, Draft Exemption Development Regulations Short-Term Letting. I would like to welcome the Minister to the meeting and his officials to the Department of Housing and Planning and Local Government. We will now consider the Planning and Development Act 2000 Exempted Development Number 2 regulations, which has been referred to the Joint Committee. Just a note on privilege. Before we begin, I wish to draw your attention to the fact that by virtue of Section 17(2)(1) of the Defamation Act 2008, witnesses are protected by absolute privilege in respect of their evidence to this committee. However, if they are directed by the committee to cease giving evidence in relation to a particular matter and you continue to do so, you are only entitled thereafter to qualified privilege in respect of your evidence. You are directed that only evidence connected with the subject matter of these proceedings is to be given, and you are asked to respect parliamentary practice to the effect that, where possible, you should not criticise nor make charges against any person, persons or identity by name or in such way as to make him or her or it identifiable. Members are reminded of the long-standing parliamentary practice to the effect that they should not comment on, criticise or make charges against a person outside of the House or an official either by name or in such way as to make him or her identifiable. I now call on Minister Murphy to make his opening statement.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, members of the committee, for affording me the opportunity to present to you today the proposed Planning and Development Act 2000 Exempted Development Number 2 regulations of 2019. As I've outlined at previous sessions with the committee, the proposed regulations will provide planning exemptions for limited short-term lettings further to the primary legislative amendments introduced in Section 38 of the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act of 2019, which was recently passed by both houses of the Oireachtas and subsequently signed into law by the President last Friday. Under the procedural requirements of the Planning and Development Act, both houses of the Oireachtas are required to approve draft planning regulations relating to exempted development by way of positive resolution before they can be signed into law by me as Minister. The consideration of the draft regulations by the committee here today is part of that statutory procedural approval process, though, as you know, we have already discussed the proposals at length. These regulations supplement the provisions introduced in relation to short-term letting in the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act of 2019, which essentially provide for the definition of short-term letting as the letting of a house or apartment or a part of a house or apartment for periods not exceeding 14 days, and that the use of a house or apartment for any short-term letting, as defined in a rent pressure zone, will be classified as a material change of use of the structure for planning permission purposes. Supplementary to the primary legislative provisions in the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act, the draft regulations presented here today provide for the following specific exemptions from planning permission. Home sharing, that is the letting of a room or rooms in a person's principal private residence, will continue to be allowed on an unrestricted basis and without the need for planning permission. Home sharers will also be allowed to sublet their entire principal private residence, be it a house or an apartment, for short-term letting for a cumulative period of up to 90 days annually, where they are temporarily absent from their home, again without being required to obtain planning permission. And where the 90-day threshold is exceeded, the planning exemption provided for in these regulations will no longer apply, and change of use of planning permission will be required. However, and this is the main change in the new arrangements provided for the Act and the draft regulations, where a person owns a property in a rent pressure zone which is not their principal private residence and intends to let it for short-term letting purposes, he or she will be required to apply for change of use planning permission unless the property has a specific permission to be used for tourism or short-term letting purposes. It will be up to the local planning authority to make a determination on such planning applications, and as I previously outlined to the committee during previous discussions on these proposals, it would be highly unlikely that planning permission would be granted for such short-term lettings in rent pressure zones, except in limited and specified circumstances which will be outlined in advisory guidelines to be issued to planning authorities. The regulations also provide for specific reporting obligations on persons engaged in home sharing and short-term letting. In the first instance, a person engaging in home sharing in their principal private residence will need to register this with their planning authority. Furthermore, a person engaged in home sharing of their entire home, that is their principal private residence, be it a house or an apartment, will need to notify their planning authority of the following: the period they intend to use their home for home sharing, when they have reached the 90-day threshold for home sharing in a principal private residence, and finally, confirm all the details of home sharing undertaken at the end of the year. In addition, I'd point out to the committee members that while the draft regulations presented here today differ slightly from previous drafts discussed by the committee, there has been no major change to the substance of the proposed provisions. The changes made are primarily structural or presentational in nature from a legal drafting perspective. I'd also point to a couple of specific additional changes that have been made since the previous draft that was presented to the committee, with a view to further strengthening and tightening up the enforceability of the provisions. Firstly, a statutory declaration provision has been inserted requiring persons engaging in home sharing in their principal private residence to make a statutory declaration that the reporting and notification information being submitted to their planning authority is true and correct. And secondly, a fairly broad provision has been inserted empowering planning authorities to request such other information as they may reasonably require for the purposes of establishing that the information submitted in the specified reporting forms in the regulations is true and correct. These provisions are aimed at ensuring that persons engaging in short-term letting of a second property, that is a property which is not their principal private residence, should not make a false declaration that the property in question is their principal private residence for the purpose of trying to avail of the planning exemptions in respect of a second such property. Where a person makes a false declaration for the purposes of the reporting obligations and trying to circumvent the short-term letting provisions in these regulations, it will therefore be an offence prosecutable under both the Statutory Declaration Act in addition to an offence under the Planning Act. It's also important to know that the regulations do not place any reporting requirements on persons letting out a room or rooms in a house or apartment that is not their principal private residence, on the basis that such persons are not entitled to avail of planning exemptions provided for in these regulations. Instead, in a rent pressure zone, it will be a clear requirement that such persons shall be obliged to apply for a change of use planning permission, and, as indicated, it will be up to the planning authorities to determine such planning applications. As mentioned in previous briefings of the committee, the new legislative changes will not affect homes, apartments or larger housing developments which already have a specific grant of planning permission for use as holiday accommodation and short-term letting. The new provisions will also not affect normal house or apartmental letting for periods in excess of 14 days, excuse me, such as executive lettings or lettings under the rent-a-room scheme. And in addition, it's important to re-emphasise that the new legislative arrangements will only apply to short-term lettings in rent pressure zones as designated under Section 24A of the Residential Tenancies Act of 2004, as amended, which are the areas of the highest housing demand and will not impact in any way on short-term letting outside of rent pressure zones where housing pressures and demand are less acute. To conclude, Chairperson, I commend these draft regulations to the committee. They are essential to support and underpin the recently enacted primary legislative amendments aimed at regulating short-term letting, as incorporated in the Residential Tenancies Act, amended of 2019. And as previously outlined to the committee, the primary objective of these new legislative reforms is to influence the bringing back of houses and apartments in rent pressure zones which are being used for short-term letting purposes to the traditional long-term rental market, thereby helping to ease the accommodation shortage pressures currently being experienced in these areas. I'd also like to place on record my thanks to the committee for its positive engagement in the consideration and development of these short-term letting legislative proposals, which I am hopeful will have the desired effect. And finally, Chairperson, if, subsequent to today's engagement, these draft regulations are approved by positive resolution of both houses of the Oireachtas, they will come into force on the 1st of July 2019, which is concurrent with the commencement of the primary legislative amendments in Section 38 of the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act of 2019. In this regard, it will be my intention to sign the regulations into law at the earliest possible date. Thank you for your attention. And just to note, Chair, we have circulated additional documentation, as I committed to at our last meeting, which outlines a draft of the newspaper advertisement that will go in all of the main papers and local papers as well, a draft web page that will be put up on the website, a draft FAQ document that will be circulated and published as well on the website that might be helpful as well to deputies and senators in liaising or contacting constituents. And in addition, there is an outline of the initial guidance that will go to planning authorities in relation to the change of use and those limited specific circumstances that will be taken into account insofar as any exemptions may be given, or not exemptions, any permissions might be given in rent pressure zones. But that is going to issue on Tuesday of next week to planning authorities, the guidance, and I'll be signing and commencing relevant pieces of legislation, provided that we have the positive motions in both houses tomorrow, following our meeting today of the Joint Oireachtas Committee. And from that point on, then I can commence the regs, sign the regs, and commence the relevant parts of the acts. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. Victor.
I think you indicated first before. I'll come afterwards.
Okay. Owen.
We're all very polite today.
Nancy.
Thanks, Minister. And first of all, just to apologise, I have to step out of the meeting for about 45 minutes, but in case it lulls you into a false sense of security, I shall be back for the second part of the meeting. Look, first of all, I want to acknowledge both the work of yourself and your officials on this. Despite disagreements that we have in other areas, this is, I think, an important piece of regulation, and I fully support it. And I'm also very encouraged by the fact, as you said yesterday on the floor of the Dáil, you've said again today, subject to the approval by the Oireachtas this week, it'll be enforceable from the 1st of July, so that's very welcome. I just have a couple of small technical questions, and really I think it's more for way of clarification so that both the committee members, myself included, and the public are very clear about all of this. Just in terms of A1 and A2, those two different definitions in the regs, my understanding is A1 is really about where it's a room or rooms in your property, whereas A2 it's when you're letting out the full property. But if you can just confirm that in as plain English as possible for clarity. The second thing is, if you could just, again, in plain English, explain the difference between the three forms, Form 15, 16 and 17, and the different functions that they have, for people who have to fill them out. I suppose my only reservation, and I did raise this at committee stage, is if I'm reading this right, there could be a requirement for a host to correspond with the local authority 4 times in a year, at the start of the year to notify them that it is their intention to seek the exemption, at the point of 45 days, at the point of 90 days, and at the end of the year. If I have that wrong, clarify that, because it was the way I read it. And then just finally, obviously, subject to approval of the Oireachtas, these regs come in the 1st of July. That then means that people who won't be eligible for this exemption will have to apply for planning permission. Many of those people are asking us, OK, so for the period between the 1st of July and when a decision on planning permission is granted, what is the status of any lettings that they have booked in at this moment? I presume a certain level of common sense will prevail, and it's really only at the end of the planning process, when a decision has been taken, that it's enforceable. But again, if you could just maybe shed a bit of light on that so there's clarity for all concerned.
Yeah, thank you. No, thank you. And look, just to say again, I very much appreciate the support that we've had through this process. This is very much a working committee, and we do get work done in terms of heavy lifting around legislation and other changes that we need to make. And that's very much in evidence here when we look at what we're trying to do in relation to short-term letting. In relation to the specific questions you asked, just for clarity, A1 relates to home sharing and A2 relates to short-term letting. So, and again, for the public, when we talk about home sharing, what we're trying to talk about is the sharing of your own home, your principal private residence, be it a room in your home or your entire home for a period but not exceeding that 90-day cap. And short-term letting is when it's not your primary residence, when it's not your home, and so you're renting it out on the short-term letting market. In relation to the forms 15, 16 and 17, and to say there'd be no costs for interacting with the local authority on this basis, I think it's an important point as well. We're not putting any cost burden on people. And for most people, they're only going to need to communicate with the local authority twice in the year, at the beginning of the year and at the end of the year, when they actually inform what actually happened. There's a Form 16, which is when you reach your 90 days cap within the year, but most people won't. Most people who do home sharing of their entire property, will do it for the 2 weeks they might be on holidays themselves in the summer, or they might do a series of weekends where they're going to be away themselves. So most people will only interact twice in the year. They might have a third interaction if they reach the 90-day cap. We've removed, on the advice of the committee, the 45-day interaction. So that's gone. In relation to, 1st of July, this is the law. And again, thank you, Deputy, for raising this yesterday in the Chamber so that people could be clear early in the week that this was happening and has to happen this week. And again, I want to thank the Shadow in particular for moving so quickly with the primary legislative changes so that we could do this week and have it in place for the 1st of July. That is the law. People who will have a second property that they've been using on a short-term letting can apply for planning permission, go through the normal planning permission procedures, and we will again communicate with the local authorities, for where this is relevant, the local authorities that are in rent pressure zones, to use common sense, that while an application for permission or retention is live, to use common sense in that regard. Now, that said, certain local authorities, and I'm thinking mainly of Dublin City because they've been to the forefront on this, they may actually already be involved in certain applications of this, right? So that's a separate thing. And we're not going to interfere with that because they're the planning authority and they make those decisions independent of us. But we have asked for common sense to apply. And again, I think it's worth stating. We've been very clear about what we've been planning to do since October of last year. The only thing that's changed really is the 1st of June moved to the 1st of July. And there was uncertainty around whether it would be only in rent pressure zones, and that was clarified earlier this year. So people have known that these changes are coming. They have been quite clear in our intent in terms of that separation between home sharing and short-term letting. So I don't think there's any surprises here either for any of the platforms or anybody who's doing this as a business.
Victor?
First, I'd like to thank the Minister for coming in and for covering in detail the issues around this. I suppose I've really just got three questions. One, I think that the draft Q&A is excellent, and I think that raises the issue about communication. It's a lot of information to take in for a lot of people, and I think we're just going to have to bear with people, and I think you've made that point. It's a very extensive Q&A, so, you know, clearly it'll be more than this. There needs to be a campaign leading into this, both through the local authorities and both centrally from your department. So you might just share with us your plans and intentions about the information, because people want to be compliant. That's the reality of it with the law. And it addresses a very, very substantial amount of issues. So you might just talk, what are your plans in terms of a sort of public relations, promotion of the whole concept of this legislation and the requirements of people? Secondly, you might just talk in some detail, you know, how these arrangements will be enforced, because that's very, very important. People need to be clear that there are repercussions for failure to comply with the regulations. So I'd like to hear a bit more about your intentions in terms of enforcement and the lead enforcement agencies there. And then finally, in terms of the resources for local authorities. So we have local authorities with further additional resources. You've talked there in some detail about the compliance with the forms, etc., and touching base with local authorities, which are ultimately the planning authority and the housing authority for that matter. So there is additional resources and demands on local authorities. And do you plan to give additional resources to those local authorities to manage those demands? Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Thank you for complimenting the FAQ. This is a change, so we need to be as clear with people as possible. And we're designing our ads at the moment. We've given some of the draft text of what might be in those ads, but really we need to say to people, I think, changes are coming. You may need to register, find out more here, and then to push people to that information that's there online. So we'll try and be as clear as we can. We were developing infographics as well to share online, but essentially what we're going to see next week in each of the main papers and in the local papers as well, we'll be taking an ad out to make that point. Changes are coming. This might affect you. You might have to register. Find out more here. We'll then repeat that ad campaign 2 weeks after that. So there'll be two public media interventions, if you like, through newspapers over the course of the month of June. In addition to that, we'll be taking web space in relevant locations, you know, banner advertising or whatever else might be the case. And there'll be a social media campaign using different channels that we have in the department to push this. We'll also be asking local authorities to push it over their own social media channels as well. You'll be aware that some local authorities, from things like Storm Emma and Storm Ophelia, have excellent social media that their people really pay attention to, because they talk about road closures and other things. So we'll be asking them to push it to their own social media channels too. And that'll be the campaign that'll be conducted to try and get the facts to as many people as possible in the rent pressure zones where it's going to affect them. In relation to enforcement, so one of the positive aspects about this when it comes to other types of planning is this activity has to happen in public for it to work. If someone needs to be able to find a property to rent, or someone wants to let a property in short-term letting, they have to advertise it, and they do that online. So while there are a number of platforms who provide this, the activity is happening publicly. So that does help in terms of kind of 90% of the heavy lifting, in terms of identifying those properties that might be short-term let it, you know, second properties as opposed to principal private residences. We've strengthened again in the regs the ability to enforce under different laws because of the declaration that we've put in. John Downey's been taking the lead from this from Dublin City Council's point of view, so he is going to be communicating with other local authorities on Tuesday of next week in relation to guidance as to how to proceed with enforcement. And the department has been in discussion in relation to additional resources, and that does mean money. It's not a significant amount of money in the overall scheme of things, but it is necessary so that new resources can be hired to do this. And there are other things that will be happening around enforcement that I won't go into detail here on, Senator, because I don't want to advertise them to the people who might be trying to evade them. But we have done a lot of looking at this. And again, because it's happening online, it does lend a certain ease to quick and steady enforcement. And then we are finalising reporting arrangements as to how enforcement is proceeding as these new changes bed down over the coming months and into next year.
In terms of resources then for local authorities?
Yeah, so we've had a number of meetings on this. There is a request for additional money, for additional hires. We will meet that request, but we're just, I suppose, negotiating the amount.
Thanks. Mick Barry.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll start by saying that I welcome the fact that short-term letting market is to be regulated. The lack of regulation has exacerbated the housing crisis and is in contrast with the norm in other countries. So this is a step forward. There are issues that I have with the proposals. I feel on balance it would be best that the proposals were to apply across the board nationally and not just in the rent pressure zones. Having said that, let's focus in a little bit about what's going to happen in the rent pressure zones. So it's been common in recent times to look at the Airbnb websites for a given town and to look at the daft.ie websites for the same place and to see that the number of properties being advertised for short-term letting outnumber the numbers that are being offered for long-term rental lease. Sometimes it's not even close. It's 2 to 1, it's 3 to 1. So the stated purpose of this legislation is to tackle that situation. Quoting from the frequently asked questions, it has resulted in some professional landlords withdrawing houses and apartments that would normally be rented on a long-term basis to instead rent them out as short-term lets, and indicates that the purpose is to tackle that, to reverse that, to get that situation sorted out. So that's my first question. If the legislation is designed to do a particular job, it would make sense to say that after a certain period of time that there would be a review to see whether that particular job has been done. So is there a proposal that we would come back to this after a given period of time, be it 6 months, 12 months, 18 months, to say, okay, has this worked, has it not worked, and if it hasn't worked, what steps do we need to take in order to strengthen these measures and in order to go further? The other question that I have, it has been raised already, but I'd like to hear a little bit more information on it, is about the resources that will be allocated to local authorities in order to make sure that the new rules and regulations are being, in large measure at least, followed. Are we going to have a situation where we have changes coming in, but it's difficult to oversee or to police them, or are the resources going to be allocated to local authorities, and specifically what steps are being taken there? So that's it.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. So the reason why it's just in rent pressure zones is the legal advice that we received was that we had to tie it to areas where there was definitely known and I suppose quantified demand and pressure on the rental market, be in relation to a lack of stock or an increase in price. And that's what rent pressure zones effectively identifies. So the legal advice was to tie it to rent pressure zones, and that's why we've done that. I mean, the objective here is to get properties that would have been long-term rentals that have gone into the short-term rental market back into the long-term rental market, which is a good thing, which means more landlords operating, actually, which I think, it's good to know that you welcome more landlords operating in this space. And then in relation to resources, in the review, yes, we will do a review. This will take a few months to bed down. And then I think it'll be wise to look at a 6 month and say, right, 6 months of this being, properly in effect, and there'll be no doubt, and there's going to be a certain, for some local authorities, they'll be quicker off the mark than others. So we'll be able to do peer reviews, certainly between local authorities. But for us as a joint Oireachtas committee, absolutely. I would think 6 months into next year would be a good time to take a review and see, well, what exactly have we achieved? But we're currently discussing with local authorities about their own reporting requirements to my department on enforcement.
6 months on the 1st of July or 6 months into next year?
6 months into next year.
Into next year?
Yeah, I think we'll have a good amount of information from that point of view, because what will happen is when we bring in the guidelines on the 1st of July, there'll be an obligation for home sharers to interact with the local authority to register. But that obligation happens annually. So we'll even have information then from the 1st of January as to has there been a change from, say, the 1st of July to the 1st of January. So we'll have the first picture there in relation to what's happening. But then 6 months on, we'll have a bit of a better idea in terms of whether anyone's hitting the 90-day cap early in the year, what's happening around enforcement in terms of not second properties, non-principal private residences. So that would be a good time. But we are discussing at the moment with local authorities their reporting requirements to me in relation to enforcement and that kind of issue, because I think that could be helpful as well. And on the matter of resources, we have been speaking to local authorities about resources, and they have made a request in relation to the kind of resources they think they need. And we're basically locking that down at the moment in terms of the allocation of additional money to certain local authorities, like, for example, Dublin City Council, who will do a lot of the heavy lifting on this because it's where the problem is most acute, as to the amount of money they will need to hire the staff they need. And we are looking at perhaps a shared function as well, in terms of every local authority has a planning authority, which is the expert when it comes to planning laws and exemptions and different things. But is there a way at which we could help each planning authority in doing 90% of the heavy lifting in identifying what properties need to be targeted, if you like? So we are looking at that as a model potentially, but we've already engaged at length with Dublin City Council as to what they need to do the job, and we'll finalise that with them, if not this week, next week.
I think the Minister may have just answered the question I had intended to ask. So just to clarify on it, that the financial allocations to the various councils would be clarified this week or next week publicly and to the committee here?
We're going to finalise finalise the amount of resources for Dublin City Council, certainly, because we've had the most engagement with them and Dublin City Council because of the experts in terms of local authorities on short-term letting enforcement. They'll be taking a lead and they'll be communicating to other local authorities next week, Tuesday of next week, I think I said earlier on, as to guidelines as to how to do this. So our first port of call is to agree with Dublin City Council the amount of money that they think they require for the coming, say, 12-month period, and we'll do that, if not... Sorry, yeah, if not this week, next week with Dublin City Council, and then we're still negotiating this idea of a shared function. So that would have an impact then on the potential amount of money that would be required by other local authorities if we can get a shared function going. So these conversations are ongoing. The next engagement, I think, is later this week with Dublin City Council. So, but the money isn't... the money is required, but it's not so significant in terms of budget lines that we can't meet what will be required. So there's no real issue around that. It's about what's the best way to manage our resources.
O'Dowd.
Apologies for being late. I was delayed in Dublin traffic for over an hour. I'm sure everybody else has the same problem. Can I just say that I welcome the regulations. I welcome the increased vigilance of attempting to ensure at least that the houses that are being let in rent pressure zones are for longer term lettings. I just have a few questions. And does it apply to every single home from the 1st of July that may at this moment in time or may in the future be let for a period less than 2 weeks or up to 14 days? So in other words, if I'm looking at the point of view, if I'm in a house now and I'm letting it, then I must apply for planning permission from the 1st of July, and I presume then that planning permission, if it's turned down, I have the right to appeal to Board Planola. So you're probably talking about before you'd have an effective decision. I suppose at the very earliest it'd probably be September, October, I would presume, or probably later. So if somebody wanted to get around the regulations, right, that's what I'm trying to look at, if they were to say that you define your short-term letting as 14 days, so say they want to do 15 days. If they say that whoever signs up for their let, it's a 15-day period, how do you make sure that you don't frustrate the Act by doing that? Because it seems that they are exempt if they're greater than 14 days. So I could just ask a few questions around that, Mr. Minister.
Thank you, Deputy. So, just to clarify as well, the guidance that will issue next Tuesday is issuing from our department, but it's been developed with the help of the experts in Dublin City Council. It's not going from Dublin City Council to the local authorities. So, if you are in your own home and you are letting a room in your own home, or you're going to let your own home for a couple of weeks.
I'm talking about a second, a non-principal private residence, yeah.
It's exempted the need for planning permission. So I'm going to talk through the tiers if I can. It's exempted the need for planning permission, but you have to register with your local authority if you're going to be letting the entire home. If it's a second property, then from the 1st of July you will need planning permission. Now, you might think that you have an established use, or you might be looking for retention, or you might be looking at a fresh planning application. It will depend. It will be a judgment call for the person who has the property. And then you go into the planning system in terms of the application process for permission,
Right.
which also allows for an appeal to the board as well. So that will happen in some instances. Like most people will understand that this is a change in the law, that if they're in a rent pressure zone, they're not going to be getting planning permission, and they will then move to regulise their affairs if they haven't already. Others who seek to actually make a case and make an appeal can do that. That's their right. And we have asked local authorities to approach this with common sense. We're also quite clear where local authorities also is already engaged in a planning enforcement issue that is separate to this. And it's important to be clear on that as well. So there will be a process of time whereby someone will be able to get clarity if they think they actually have a legitimate case. But the planning authorities know what's going on here. So where someone might be trying to, I suppose, extend their period of use of their second property for short-term letting, even though they really don't have a strong case, the planning authorities will be able to take measures in such an instance. But the law is the law in relation to applications and appeals, and that's not changing, so they'll be able to go through that.
Point then, if I understand it correctly, that if it's not my principal private residence, I'm in a rent pressure zone, if I intend to let for, I register anyway if I'm letting, but if I'm going to do short-term letting, I have to apply for planning permission. But that's restricted to a defined period of 14 days. I'm just trying to see how people might try to frustrate it if they could. So if I say I'm letting my non-principal private residence for periods longer than 14 days, but I could actually be doing it for 15 days, does that frustrate the Act?
That's okay. So if you have a second property, you don't register. It's just not allowed. You seek planning permission, and if you're in a rent pressure zone, more than likely you're going to be denied. We've defined short-term letting as periods of 14 days or less to capture that short-term period of people making city stays, or even a longer 2-week vacation, as someone might do in Dublin City. But what we don't want to rule out is the possibility of using a second property for longer stays. So, for example, if you were, let's say you had your own home and you were doing substantial refurbishment to it, you might need to rent another property for 3 months. We don't want to stop that from happening. What we don't want to stop happening is, and we have feedback on this, someone might have to travel up to Dublin because a relative might be ill and might stay near the hospital for a period of time. We don't want to stop that happening either. And then executive letting, where someone is arriving into the country to be here to work for 2, 3, 4 years, and they need a couple of months before they can find a place for a long-term rental. We don't want to stop that happening either. So we've made that carve-out for those types of situations, while still capturing what is primarily what we're seeing in cities like Cork and Dublin. People coming in
I agree very much what you're doing. I'm just trying to for weaknesses.
I mean, and again, as you know, because we've been through it so many times in this committee, we've kind of gained all the different potential scenarios where someone might try and evade what is the clear intention of the law. And we believe that they've all been captured adequately in the definitions that we put in primary legislation, and now in the regulations that are coming, and then in the guidance that will issue to local authorities.
And the other point is that if and when a rent pressure zone is removed, that means that none of these regulations then apply because you're not in a rent pressure zone. So I think the key to the proposal is that it's based on a shortage of accommodation for families and for people who need it long term. I think that's the key point, and there's no penalty being imposed. I mean, somebody's on to me about living in a non-pressure, living as they were in the rent pressure zone, so this doesn't apply to them. So there's no problem there.
I think it's important. It's a very good question, actually. So the rent pressure zones in the recent legislation that we passed only last week, I think, extends all rent pressure zones out to 2021. And what it also did was change the qualifying criteria so that new areas will come in as rent pressure zones. And this legislation is tied to the operation of rent pressure zones. So long as there is a rent pressure zone in existence, this legislation will apply. But what we want to get to is a point whereby we're actually regulating the sector. So this is a change in the planning law so the planning authorities can stamp out a certain practice. But the ultimate long-term objective, when pressures have come off the housing sector, is to be able to have an actual regulatory system whereby at some point in the future, and I can't say when now, but certainly not before 2021, someone might be able to have a second property used for short-term letting in Dublin City.
No, that's fine. Thank you. Thank you.
Minister, and I think a lot of concerns that I would have been answered. Well, I think I'm more confused now, Minister, because to every question has been enforcement, you're going to come back. Timescale, you're going to come back. Resources, you're going to come back. you're going to start an awareness campaign and you think Dublin will be the lead in this. Now, I do understand short-term lettings are very much more in Dublin and the cities, but I think, Minister, you need to come in here with a more positive... Look, we all welcome it, and I believe it is good long-term, but I just kind of think here, every question that has been asked has been, I'm going to check that out now, it's going from the 1st of July. Hang on, Minister, just... Yeah.
I've answered every question this morning. Please, Senator, you came in late and now you're saying that I haven't answered questions.
I've been listening. So, Enforcement Minister, who's going to enforce this, our timescale? Like, if you have an issue on timescale, we asked about awareness. I said, oh, okay, you said that. Look, I'm not being in the sense of I think this is welcome. And, Minister, I have been on the Housing Committee and would have made many a concern to you about things in particular. I do know this is particular in cities, but what I'm saying is, when it comes to regulation, and this is welcome, absolutely, I'm delighted and I think well done. But I think we need to, it's like local authorities, you're saying it is the discretion of local authorities to, you know, see a case and they have to kind of work within, I don't know, is it Dublin is going to be the lead base or what will happen? All I'm just saying is, could you, for our next meeting, come in with a plan of enforcement on timescale, the 1st of July, when will you know, from then on, will it be a year, will it be 6 months, will it be 8 months? Again, now you did say about the awareness, I think we need to maybe know for definite what is the awareness campaign for this, maybe give us more details on this, because look, it's good, it's like everything, it's knowing your information, Minister, and about it is what's important here. The rent pressure zones, I know we're gone to 2021 and that now, that's important. I've had issues on that before, but can I ask you this as well? You said now the criteria has changed. When will that change come? When are we expecting that particular change? I'm 7 years waiting to get reviews on the local authorities done. 7 years since it's been done, 8 years now, and I've been promised 2 years ago we would deliver on that. And I'm not being negative here, Minister, I do understand. But what I'm saying is, you gave a commitment there, and we said that the rent pressure zones would go to 2021. That's fine, the criteria has changed. Will you come back to us next week or within a few weeks of when that criteria is changing and when the other counties like my own will qualify to go on it, please? And just all I'm asking is, again, I'm saying it's welcome, but I feel myself now, there's a lot of questions being answered with no answer. And I think, Minister, and I'm not saying that in a bad way, Minister, I'm actually not, but I'm just saying, could you come back in the next few weeks with this and give us the answers that I'm looking for on money for the particular areas, or particular if it's Dublin or Cork or wherever that need the extra staff, who is going to be the lead body, what local authorities' role will play in this, what is going to happen in enforcement, what's the timescale, and just more information on the awareness campaign. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator. I've answered every question that's been put to me so far this morning. I've answered it with clarity. This is our 4th engagement on the short-term letting regulations. We've already made the changes in planning. You've had the draft regs now for a couple of months, and this morning you've gotten additional supporting documentation. I won't be coming back to you in a future meeting with additional information because I've given all the information that I have. The only thing that I haven't given you is the amount of money that I'm going to be giving to Dublin City Council and other local authorities because it's currently under negotiation. But of course, at a future meeting, I can provide that amount of money because it'll have been decided by then. What I did say to one of your colleagues is that enforcement and resources is not about amount of money because there is sufficient money in the budget line to provide for that. So that won't be an issue in terms of actually allowing enforcement to happen. In relation to the planning authorities, they will be the ones doing enforcement. They will get guidance, as I said earlier, from my department next week as to how they're to enforce this. What I did say was that we may have a shared resource or function behind those individual planning authorities to help do 90% of the lifting. And that'll be worked out depending on, as we enforce these new planning laws, what exactly we think might need to change to help planning authorities do it better. But we recognise that in certain areas, certain planning authorities have more work to do because they have more of an issue, and that's why I keep on referring to Dublin City Council. I've been working on this for so long. In relation to the information campaign, I have given you draft documentation for the information campaign. I also gave you the timelines around the information campaign as to what's going to be happening over the course of June. The first advertisements, I said, next week in every national paper and the local papers, and a follow-up advertisement to follow 2 weeks from that. I also mentioned banner ad campaigns that will happen over the month of June, as well as a social media campaign. I also mentioned a frequently asked questions document that's been provided to you and will be provided to everyone in the House to share with their constituents as well, who may get in touch with them. And in relation to the RPZ qualifying criteria, they have now changed in law as a result of the legislation that was passed in the Shannon last week, and thank you for your help with that. And that will then come into effect as we get updated data from the RTB, which then goes to the housing agency, who then make a recommendation to me that new areas will have qualified for an RPZ because they've met the new qualifying criteria. And that process will begin, I think, from next month.
No, sorry, thank you. No, just, Minister, I would have concerns, and I think some of the answers there I'm still not happy with. I think there is still issues there that need to be sorted out. I think the money is the biggest issue here, and you know yourself, Minister, everything boils down to money and resources. It doesn't matter what regulation you bring in. It doesn't matter what local authority you work for. If you haven't got regulation and money and enforcement, it doesn't work. And again, I'm just saying about the awareness campaign, you did say that. I just think for us it would be good to promote it. I'm going to promote this, Minister. I actually have to say this regulation is really good, and I'm welcoming it. But I always feel things fall when there's no money there to support it, when there's lack of communication. So all I'm just saying to you is I think you need to promote it more. I think there's still unanswered questions that I feel you haven't come across to me. But okay. Well, okay. Well, Minister, in the next few weeks, then you'll come back to us with all the different things. Yeah.
As opposed to fake news.
No, I'm just saying there is issues. Yeah, no, absolutely not.
Sure, like I'm fair enough. What questions?
The questions were answered.
Okay. Well, look, if you come back to us with timescales on enforcement, what's going to happen on planning, I know.
I've already answered these questions.
Yeah, I know you did, but you didn't give. I'm not happy with them.
Like I got them clearly.
No, you didn't. I don't know.
Fourth session on these.
Okay, well, money, Minister, you didn't answer that one.
I told you I'm negotiating that with Dublin City Council. That's not a negotiation for you to have with Dublin City Council through me. I said the money isn't an issue. We have enough money. It's a question of what we're going to actually allocate for those resources, and that's happening at the moment. And I will come back to you with the actual figure once it's agreed. I said that clearly twice.
But Minister, you should have this. Okay.
I shouldn't have to what? Sorry, Senator. No, let's be fair.
Look,
I shouldn't have to what?
Okay, Minister.
Yeah.
Deputy Barry.
I'll be brief. Credit where credit's due, Minister. These are very good regulations. They will make a difference. And actually it's quite radical what you've done. So I say fair play to you and to the officials. The one question I have really is around the proof of the principal private residence and whether somebody's actually living there. And I note in the notes, so this potential for abuse essentially, right? You mention documents or bills and stuff as documentary evidence that the person is actually living there, and that wouldn't prove that someone was living there. They could easily not be living there, but the bills would still be in their name. So I think you've got to think a bit more about that one, about how do you establish that somebody is actually living in their principal private residence and not abusing the new regulations. So you might comment on that, but other than that, fair play. You need to do a lot more on all the rest of the aspects of the housing crisis, but in this area,
That's the next session.
Yeah, I mean, maybe I should be worried that if Deputy Boyd Barrett thinks it's radical, maybe I need to take a step back. No, I appreciate your comments, Deputy, I do. Look, you're absolutely right about some people will try to get around this. People will always try and break or evade the law. The vast majority of people are law-abiding in this country, and so they will move to regularise their position now that they know these changes are coming into effect. But in relation to people who have to give documentation to the planning authorities, we have provided very, very wide powers actually to them in terms of the documentation they can request. The planning authorities they've got a history of dealing with people around where they live in their principal private residence and requesting documentation and looking at fake documentation. The thing is, they won't be coming to a person blind. They won't be coming without a deep suspicion. When they move to enforce, it'll be because a lot of heavy lifting will have been done in the background to identify a property that they think, hold on a second now, this is being used for continuous short-term letting, and it's not someone's home. And then they will be moving from a point of suspicion, and so they can ask for one document, two documents, they can ask for a lot more documentation. And in the regs, we've actually enforced it by saying that if someone knowingly gives a false declaration, then that's an even further breach, separate to the planning laws, which provides it more enforceability powers as well. So we've strengthened up those aspects of things because we know that when it comes to that end of things, they will be dealing with people who probably are in breach and knowingly, and so they'll need those extra powers to really be able to get that from them.
Just maybe a few quick questions in relation to it, Minister. I'm trying to find them now. Yeah, I suppose Deputy Barry did raise it, and I've raised it before about, and I know you're saying it had to be on a legal basis why we haven't rolled this out nationally, and I can kind of accept it, but it's quite good regulation that we're introducing, and I don't see why we can't just bring it in nationwide. And then what happens if a rental pressure zone is no longer in a rental pressure zones, which is indeed a possibility. The other thing is, have you had, and I'm sure you've had, engagement with the short-term letting platforms, that they've been part of this process? And my final one, again, will be something that I've spoken on before, is the regulation around the short-term letting platforms themselves. And while I understand, and you've told me that it is not within your remit, it's in another minister's remit, I think it's a critical piece that is required and can assist a lot easier and make this whole process, what you're introducing, a lot simpler for the local authorities if there was regulation around on the short-term letting platforms themselves. From my engagement here with you today and listening to today, it looks like, and I could be wrong on this, you will be providing a shared service for all the local authorities, and that shared service probably will be the one that collates all the data that can feed the information to the local authority to identify properties who are breaching the regulation. But if we had regulation on the short-term letting platforms today, that information would be automatically provided by that short-term letting platforms to each local authority so that they could act on it. And I suppose the other thing, and for a person who's involved in tourism, is that industry needs to be regulated from a customer point of view, that they have, like a tourist coming to Ireland today who's staying in a short-term letting platform, there's no regulation to protect them. So not alone is it in relation to assisting each local authority, it also will provide a better experience for the visitor coming to Ireland or the tourist. That's why I think the other part of this is critical for the success of this piece of legislation, is the regulation around the short-term letting platforms themselves. And I understand, and you've said it to us before, that it's not within your remit, but I am asking you to stress on that, Minister, the importance of regulating the short-term letting platforms, both from the tourism point of view and indeed from in relation to dealing and providing valid, accurate information to each local authority to allow them to act under the regulation that you're bringing in today.
Thanks, Chair.
Could I just on that note come in and just on the back of that, just one point I wanted to make?
Okay.
It's directly related to that, and I don't know if it is your remit, but your very good suggestions there prompted me on this. I got a few calls recently from people who had Airbnb. Short-term letting. Short-term letting tourists who had thought that they had booked a place to stay for a short-term letting here, arriving at the houses of people who weren't letting at all, right? So somebody, some fraudster, had identified, said this such and such a house is, you've just rented it, paid, and this person had 3 in about 2 months. It was in my area, I can't remember which part, right? Had people arriving in the middle of the night, families and kids, saying, I've rented your house, and the person hadn't got a clue. It's quite extraordinary. So somebody, needs to pass up the line that something needs to be done about that.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Deputy. And I have done short-term letting myself, and I've often wondered, as I approach the property, would the person be there, and would my weekend be about to fall through, right? So I understand the concerns from the tourist point of view. Tourism, unfortunately, doesn't come under my brief, but it is something I think that we all recognise that this new type of activity, and it is still relatively new, it's been going on for a few years now, but it's becoming increasingly popular, does need a different type of regulation than what we're trying to do, because our focus, of course, is on housing and long-term letting. And we have had discussions between my department and Minister Ross's department about that next stage that needs to happen, regulation of the platforms. And it cuts across as well, Chair, and you identified this in your right to it, cuts across as well to the regulation of other platforms that advertise letting properties. So it's in a similar space, but not the same space, whereby there should be an obligation on a publisher of a website to ensure that they are not allowing the advertisement of illegal practices, if you like. So I'm talking about substandard accommodation and everything else. So these are pieces of work that need to be done. That falls to the Department of Justice, but of course we're engaged with them in that as well. And there's a bill going through the House where that's been proposed by a deputy, I can't remember from which party, to do something on that. So we're going to engage on that. And so yes, I would like to move to a point where we're regulating the platforms as well. And I think that will be necessary anyway over the next coming of years for the reasons that have been identified by you, Chair, and you, Deputy Boyd Barrett, but also because it will help around enforcement. And if in the future we want to loosen things a bit because, you know, there isn't the pressure that we're seeing today, that might be warranted as well. Chair, in relation to your questions, so yes, we were initially looking at nationally applying these changes in planning laws, but the advice from the Attorney General was that we had to, on the balance of rights, tied to areas where we had a kind of quantified and established demand and pressure, and that was around pressure zones. The existing law was the easiest way to do it, if you like. So that's why we went through the RPZ legislation. In relation to engagement with the short-term letting platforms, yes, we've had engagement with them, the Department of Transport, as I said, Fáilte Ireland, the Corporate Housing Alliance, Irish Self-Catering Federation, because obviously we wanted to make sure there was a carve-out for holiday homes, and there is. So there have been engagements with all the different people who might be interested in this sector. And around a shared service, that is the model that I would like to apply, because I think it's probably the most efficient. A potential shared service that would do a lot of the groundwork and would then submit to planning authorities, reasons for concern, if you like, and then the planning authorities, being the experts and the ones with the actual competence and responsibility, would then go forward with that. So that is something that we are looking at. But as in from the 1st of July, each planning authority will have both the legal understanding, they'll have the clarity around how to enforce the regulations, and they will then proceed to deal with planning applications as they are submitted and the building of registers in their own areas. So that will be the planning authorities in the relevant local authorities.
Okay. Can I first of all acknowledge the work that the committee has done in relation to this whole area of the short-term letting platforms. I think I was raised with Minister Coveney in my first Housing Committee meeting, and since then we've done quite a detailed report, and I welcome that the Minister has taken that report into consideration in this as well. So it's taken a bit longer than we all hoped, but we are here today in what we all agree is an important piece of legislation. I would ask the Minister to stress on the corresponding Minister to try and regulate the platforms now, because that would be of significant help to each local authority in regulating this, and thanks for his engagement today. As we now have completed our consideration of the Planning and Development Act 2000 Exempted Development No. 2 Regulation 2019, the Clerk will send a message to the effect that the Clerk of the Dáil, in accordance with Standing Order 90, and to the Clerk of the Senate in accordance with Standing Order 75, these messages deemed to be the report of the committee. We will suspend here for a few minutes while we allow our next witnesses to take their seats. Thank you. Item number 7 on the agenda is update on Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan for Housing and Homeless. Our second topic today is the quarterly update from the Minister in respect of Rebuilding Ireland Action Plan. This update is on the progress achieved during the first quarter of 2019. I now call on Minister Murphy to make her opening statement.
Thank you, Chair. And I want to thank Chair and the members of the committee for the opportunity to appear again this morning and to give you an update on the progress that we've made in terms of implementing Rebuilding Ireland to the end of March of this year. And I'm joined today by John McCarthy, Secretary-General, and Assistant Secretaries Maria Graham, Mary Hurley and Paula Mass. As I've stated on many occasions, supporting families and individuals experiencing homelessness continues to be a priority for this government and for myself as Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government. That is why we are so focused on the accelerated delivery of social, affordable and private housing and the reform of our rental sector and of our planning system. This morning, the Department is publishing the homelessness report for April. The report shows that in April there was an overall increase of 73 people in emergency accommodation. The report also shows that there was a reduction of 4 families and 27 dependents from March. In Dublin, where the problem of family homelessness is most pronounced, we are seeing some positive results arising from the prevention work being carried out by the Dublin Regional Homeless Executive. In the first 4 months of the year, 1 in 2 families presenting to homeless services in the Dublin region were prevented from having to enter emergency accommodation. That is progress, but it's nowhere near enough. We're also seeing increased exits, with 329 families exiting emergency accommodation to a home in the first 4 months of the year. So some improvements and some progress, but still a very big challenge ahead. The monthly homeless report does not provide enough detail as to the different challenges we are facing and the different reasons people are entering emergency accommodation. And my department has been working to introduce a revised reporting system so that we can publish more detailed reports on a quarterly basis. My department will continue to publish the numbers in emergency accommodation each month, but the publication of more detailed reports on a quarterly basis will allow for better analysis and actions on this subject. My department has also commissioned the Housing Agency to undertake detailed research on homelessness. This research will examine in detail the reasons for both families and individuals presenting to our services, and the research will promote continued policy development to reduce the numbers of households presenting as homeless and to ensure that the correct supports are provided to support an exit from homelessness within the shortest possible timeframe. The research will also examine barriers being faced both by single adults in families in moving from emergency accommodation. And while we seek to provide homes for households in emergency accommodation, we are working to ensure that we have sufficient and appropriate emergency accommodation in place. And so for families, we are continuing to deliver on a programme of family hubs to ensure we have increased accommodation available that is appropriate for families and their children. We now have 27 hubs in operation nationally, providing 650 units of accommodation, with further hubs being developed. I recently met with the Ombudsman for Children and we discussed a number of issues raised in his recent report, and my department will be working with the local authorities and the various service providers to ensure that we can address a number of the issues raised. However, it is important to recognise that hubs, while a better temporary response than hotels, are just that, they are temporary. Our ultimate priority is to ensure that families in hubs are supported to exit a home in the shortest time possible. One of the recommendations in the report that my department has been progressing is the introduction of a national quality standards framework for homeless accommodation. The framework, which has been successfully introduced in the Dublin region, will be introduced nationally over a 12-month period from the 1st of July. The overarching aim of the framework is to ensure that the services we provide to individuals and families experiencing homelessness are well organised, coordinated, integrated and focused on moving people out of homelessness into sustainable homes as quickly as possible. The standards will ensure greater consistency in the national response to homelessness and will also support service providers by providing a clear framework for the delivery of effective services. In terms of social housing delivery, we're continuing to build on significant progress that was made between 2016 and 2018 in terms of supporting new households. My department is currently validating returns from all 31 local authorities and will shortly be publishing the local authority breakdown of delivery against targets for Q1. Indicative delivery outputs reflect that more than 5,800 additional homes, have been provided in the first 3 months of this year across all of the various social housing delivery programmes, including build, acquisition, leasing, the housing assistance payment and RAS. This includes more than 1,200 additional social homes provided by local authorities and AHBs under build, acquisition and leasing programmes. As you will be aware, my department publishes a quarterly construction status report, and this report is a compendium of the new build programmes across the 31 local authorities for new build social housing activity for the duration of Rebuilding Ireland. By the end of 2018, the number of new build social homes now delivered or in the pipeline stood at over 19,000 of the overall build target of 33,600, with nearly 5,000 homes on site and under construction, and a further 2,569 homes at the final pre-construction stage. The Q1 2019 report will be finalised in the coming days, and given the rate of new projects being added to the programme going on site and completing, I expect this to show a very good pipeline against the overall target. We've also seen positive news from the CSO in the last month regarding the number of new homes built in the last year. Almost 19,000 new homes were built in the year to the end of the first quarter of 2019, representing an increase of 25% on the year to the end of the first quarter of 2018. And in addition, more than 2,600 homes were bought out of long-term vacancy, and almost 800 homes in unfinished housing estates were completed, meaning over 22,200 homes became available for use in the year to the end of March, which is up 19% on the previous period. This does not include the nearly 3,600 bed spaces completed in the student sector in the year to end Q1 of 2019, and we remain on course to meet our Rebuilding Ireland target of 25,000 new homes to live in by the end of this year. Clearly, Rebuilding Ireland is substantially increasing the supply of new homes, and we need to drive new builds higher again over the course of the rest of this year and on into 2020. We also know that this increase in supply is contributing to the moderation in the growth of house prices, which is crucially important in terms of housing affordability, particularly in Dublin and in certain other of our main urban centres. In terms of our programme for affordable purchase, last June I commenced Part 5 of the Housing Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 2009. This placed the new affordable purchase scheme on a statutory footing, and in March of this year I signed regulations under which local authorities make their schemes of priorities, providing the administrative framework through which homes will ultimately be made available under the scheme. To date, 26 of the 31 local authorities have submitted draft schemes to my department, and these are now being approved at local authority level. My department is currently working in respect of the further regulations and guidance needed to put in place the administrative process to complete the affordable purchase scheme, and I would anticipate that these will be in place in the autumn. One of the mechanisms available to local authorities to help them deliver affordable housing options is the Service Sites Fund. €310 million is available in grant funding out to 2021 for infrastructure, which will support the provision of up to 6,200 affordable homes. In December of last year, I approved funding of €43 million under the fund, which will enable the delivery of 1,400 affordable homes on local authority lands in Dublin and in Cork. An example of the progress that can be supported through the Service Sites Fund is apparent in Cork City, where planning permission was recently approved for 147 homes in Boyhan Road. This will see the delivery of social and affordable housing solutions, along with a creche and ancillary works, with work starting on site over the coming weeks. A second call under the fund issued last month to 19 local authorities, and 29 submissions from 15 local authorities have been received under the second call. These are currently being assessed, and I intend to announce approvals under the second call before the end of June. Service Sites funding is also available to local authorities who wish to provide cost rental options. Acknowledging that renters in Dublin and other urban centres are also currently facing significant affordability challenges, I'm committed to the introduction of a not-for-profit cost rental sector in Ireland. Ultimately, it is envisaged that cost rental options will be delivered as a national programme at scale and in areas of high demand. My department has engaged the European Investment Bank on a research project to help us identify the optimum operational and financial model for cost rental in Ireland. Notwithstanding this, progress is being made in the shorter term through advancing pilot cost rental projects, and this has involved many actors working together in partnership. I'm glad to say that this work is now coming to fruition, and we will see construction on our first cost rental development at the Enniskerry Road site beginning next month. In relation to the rental sector, the Residential Tenancies Amendment Act of 2019 was passed earlier this month. I expect to sign a commencement order later this week to bring a majority of provisions into operation. The Act provides a number of key measures and reforms designed to enhance enforcement powers for the RTB, provide greater security of tenure for tenants, and further underpin the operation of the rent pressure zone arrangements until the end of 2021. The duration of tenancy termination notice periods are significantly extended under the Act, and, for example, a minimum of 180 days' notice must be provided by landlords who terminate a tenancy of between 3 and 7 years' duration. The Residential Tenancies Act will now apply to student-specific accommodation let under tenancy or licence by private providers and public educational institutions. My department is working closely with the RTB to ensure that adequate resources are provided to facilitate a smooth introduction of both the new sanctioning regime and annual registration of tenancies. As committee members will be aware, Project Ireland 2040 signalled very clearly the government's intention to shift away from business-as-usual, sprawl-based development patterns and to adopt instead more compact, sustainable and community-centred development approaches. Project Ireland 2040, through the National Planning Framework and the National Development Plan, is being implemented so that we can continue to plan proactively and prudently for a population increase of 1,600,000 new jobs and over 550,000 new homes. It's not just about national strategic planning, but also about strengthening the regional and local level planning tiers as well. The first of 3 regional spatial and economic strategies to give effect to the National Planning Framework has recently been approved. The other 2 regional strategies will be approved in the coming months. Approval of the regional strategy for the Eastern and Midland Regional Assembly area, which includes Dublin earlier this month, means that all county development plans in the region must now commence either a variation or full review process before the end of the year. Local development plans in the other two regions will follow suit once the regional strategies are approved. To support this, my department is preparing updated guidance for local authorities and development plan preparation that will also include guidance on housing demand assessment. The purpose of this is to enable local planning authorities to better provide for and identify the location and type of housing that will be required in the future. As part of this overall approach, the establishment of the Land Development Agency last year means that there is now a delivery vehicle to work with public bodies and others in using public lands to provide housing and to act as a catalyst to stimulate regeneration and wider investment to achieve compact urban growth. We expect to see the first homes being delivered on the initial tranche of 8 LDA sites by next year. The agency is currently very active in identifying further lands and sites and is tasked with taking a long-term view in the sustainable development and management of the State Land Bank. In terms of delivering more effective oversight of the planning system, Mr Niall Cullen has now been appointed as Ireland's first planning regulator, with an important role in ensuring that the planning process properly implements Project Ireland 2040. The Office of the Planning Regulator will independently assess statutory plans, conduct examinations and reviews of local authority and on planning functions, and drive a national programme of planning research as well as information and education. This ongoing process of improvement, reform and institutional change signifies the critical need to respond to the challenges we face in order to make a key contribution to the delivery of housing and the shaping of our country over the next number of years. And finally, I want to thank the committee for the invitation today. I look forward to working with you throughout 2019. Of course, answer any questions the committee members may have. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Minister. Just to remind the members, what we have agreed this morning was that we're taking all the pillars at the one time, and each member will have 5 minutes, and then the Minister will have 5 minutes to come back, and then we can go into a second round if we have to. Senator Boyhan.
First, I'd like to thank the Minister and the Secretary-General and his staff for coming in today and having this engagement. I think it's important, it's ongoing, and I think it helps our work and it helps us to understand what you're about. So I'm just going to keep my questions brief, Minister. I suppose one, I want to refer to 101, which is addressing homeless in the Rebuilding Ireland. And you mentioned about, or it was mentioned that we will accelerate and expand the rapid build housing programme to provide first instance and as priority more suitable accommodation for families that are currently residing in commercial hotels. And you might just give us an update on that in terms of the targets. I know the targets are 1,500 for the period of the Rebuilding Ireland, and just where we are in relation to that now and the delivery of the homes. Actually, I think it was 1,100 homes by 2021, but you might just comment on that. In relation to the housing summit, you organise a number of housing summits, and there was a lot of discussion in the media about those housing summits. You might elaborate and tell us how these housing summits have gone, particularly the local ones. As a result of the summit, you suggested that you would engage with the 31 local authorities. How are they going? What's been made of them? What are the issues that are coming up with them? And what are the additional supports that are required by the local authorities? Because I think that's important. In terms of the affordability and the scheme of priorities, there was setbacks there. I know in my own local authority, Dunleary Down, they didn't necessarily agree with it. I know there was ongoing engagement with your department and the officials and the county councillors. And eventually, I've been having a second opportunity to look at it. They agreed it. But that was disappointing, I have to say, for a number of points of view. But I'm not going to comment in any great detail. Just you might confirm that all of them are in agreement now in terms of getting on with the scheme of priorities for the affordable housing. Galway came up as an issue in the past, and there were problems about the delivery of the housing, particularly last year. And you might just talk us through that, how that's been addressed and how it's been dealt with. There were one or two other things in relation to the Land Development Agency. You might just confirm where we are in relation to the Land Development Agency and the Dundrum Central Mental Hospital site, which is a very substantial site and has great opportunities to provide some housing. And then also you might talk on, if you 3.15, it relates to the affordable housing scheme on state lands. And I've said time and time again, the potential here for state lands, be they in harbour companies, be they in Irish Rail, bus stations, I think we can use imaginative approaches of moving out some of these sites to other places. I think there can be imaginative approaches about some of these sites that are in key residential areas. And I'm thinking also about Thornton Hall and the potential of Thornton Hall. You may not be able to tell us too much about Thornton Hall, but I think there are challenges, but there are also opportunities in relation to Thornton Hall. And finally, Minister, I want to ask you, are you going to reach the targets of 25,000 new homes this year? You set that target You put a certain amount of pressure on yourself for that, and I would like if you could just tell the committee, are you confident that you can deliver on a target of 25,000 new homes this year?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Senator, for the questions. Give me 2 seconds so I can give you the right information. So in relation to your first point that you made, actually, I think is a really important one to make, Chair. You talked about the ongoing work that we're doing in reviewing Rebuilding Ireland. This is a working committee. I said it earlier on. And we work through different problems that we have, different challenges. Issues are raised, and we try and resolve them. And just very recently, whether it's in relation to the short-term letting regulations or the new Residential Tenancies Act, we've made some very good work and made some very good progress. And so I very much appreciate the engagements that we have. And I hope that you appreciate the documentation that we provide in terms of the update on the action plan and different reports that we give. And to take it as an opportunity to thank my officials for the engagement they do offline as well. In relation to the rapid build pipeline, the first point I want to make is that rapid prefab off-site technology construction is not just for homeless. I know that's how it was initially introduced as a concept, but it's now, very much taking over from traditional build in the private sector and in other areas, and what they're able to do now is fantastic in terms of the quality. It is a quicker form of development once you're on site, but you can't get around the things you need to do before you get on site in terms of procurement or planning or anything else. But we have at the moment over 1,100 such builds in the pipeline. Over 400 have already been delivered, over 200 are on site, and we're about to see the new volumetric programme, which is using the prefab off-site construction technology for multi-storey. We have 300 of those to go on sites in the next quarter. So that's where we are with that particular pipeline. In relation to the workshops, and thank you for reminding me of this, we did have 2 already. We've had 2, with 1 further regional workshop to come. They're being chaired or hosted by the department working with the CCMA, and they're looking at a range of issues, from the targets that each local authority has under the different streams of delivery, to the use of land and the appropriate use of land and what land can be used, affordable modelling. So each local authority was asked to do an economic assessment around affordable modelling. That's been addressed as well. Collaboration with housing bodies, which is very important because housing bodies have been raising the issue around land themselves. As well as then the provision of emergency accommodation, standards in emergency accommodation. That's been addressed. And vacancy and the vacancy teams that are now there and the vacancy plans. So it's a chance to do what we do at the summit in a more in-depth manner with each region, because there are different challenges in each region. And you alluded, Senator, to the Galway Task Force. That's a challenge that we have in Galway. So we've taken the model that we used in Cork, which is now proven to be successful, and we've applied it to Galway. There has been a meeting already of the task force. Geraldine Tallon, who is a former Secretary General of this department, is chairing the Cork Task Force, is chairing the Galway Task Force as well. So they're having another meeting in early June to look at land in particular, I think, as to how that's going to help unlock the delivery problem that they're having in Galway. In relation to the scheme of priorities, we've had 26 schemes submitted to the department. Local authorities have approved 10 in all of the Dublins and Galway and Cork. So we want to get the remaining schemes over the line. We have a pipeline in place happening around affordability, so it's important they are in line. Different local authorities have taken different approaches in terms of the flexibility that they have. But I'm open to keeping this under review. I understand what's happened in Dún Laoghaire, and I've spoken to representatives from Dún Laoghaire as about some of the changes they'd like to see in the future. Let's see how this initial scheme works. The scheme was developed in consultation with members here in the House. We believe it's a good scheme and priority, but if people think that further amendments can be made, I'm open to them. But let's get the ones agreed where we're going to have the houses delivered first, and let's get them working. In relation to the LDA in Dundrum, well, I can't share this document, Senator. I do have a dashboard here in relation to what's happening in Dundrum, and I'll give you just an overview of the timeline that we have around the Dundrum site. Looking at there's already design development underway for that site. They are looking to submit or to go for a full design competition in Q3 of this year, and have a detailed design then in place next year, and to go for planning then. I think it's either Q2 or Q3 of next year. We will have vacant possession of the hospital, we believe, at the end of Q3 of next year. So a lot of work is happening now on the design side Also, to get ready for the planning application to go in. And of course, we need to have engagement with local stakeholders as well to make sure that what I don't want to see happen, which sometimes happen, is an agency or department of the government comes to a proposal, and the first proposal is so out of kilter with what is needed for the site that any kind of reform or change of that proposal, people aren't even open to considering it. So we need to make sure that once we actually have possession of the site, that we can move quickly with a development that people will support. And not everyone will support, Senator, you know as well as I do. People are objecting to housing in their areas for a whole host of different reasons or excuses, depending on the reasons being proffered. But we will be sensitive to local concerns as much as we can be, while recognising that we can deliver a lot of affordable housing on this site in the future. And then, in relation to the other function the LDA has, is to better manage state sites, so to identify where an existing use might not be optimal. Yes, we're looking at that. I mean, some sites, now that we look at them, may not require the moving of a function, but actually you could build over that existing function. So that's what's been looked at as well, because, again, when we look to other cities, they have been quite efficient in doing that, allowing a site, an existing function to remain, but actually being able to go up. And the changes that we've made around densities and heights will allow us to do that on certain sites.
Finally, just in relation to the targets, the target of 25,000 new homes, you gave a commitment that you could deliver that.
Yeah.
How are we getting on with that?
So the commitments there's a couple of commitments under Rebuilding Ireland when it comes to delivery of new homes. And one of those key commitments is the 25,000 new homes to live in 2019. And this is where I think we're at, and what's going to be the component of those 25,000 new homes this year. So if we look at what happened in 2018, we saw a 25% increase on the previous year, 2017. If we project, and we have to work on projections, it's not an exact science, we're not building these homes ourselves. We make changes in law or in regulations to allow these homes to be built, separate from the ones that we're building directly ourselves. More than 6,000 will be delivered through our own programmes. But I think if we estimate a 15 to 25% increase in 2019 on 2018 activity, we'll see between 20,700 and 22,500 new homes built this year. Now, what supports that is we had 22,000 commencements in 2018, and in Q1 of this year, we had 5,758 commencements, which is up 31% on Q1 of 2018. So that's the range that we're looking at there. Then when we look at long-term vacancy, I think we can assume a range of 2,000 to 2,500 more homes coming out of vacancy in 2019. And if you look at what happened in the first quarter of this year, 559 homes came out of long-term vacancy. And then if we look at unfinished housing estates, what we'll see is somewhere between 300 to 500 homes. And we talk about them being unfinished housing estates, but anyone who's had this problem in their own constituency will know that really nothing was built at all. You might have just opened a site, not even put down the floor plates. That is, a full build that has to happen. But we think about 300 to 500. In the first quarter of this year, about 182 homes were completed on that side of the ledger. So when I look at it then, stepping back from that, I am confident that we'll reach 25,000 new homes becoming available for use this year, given those figures that we've seen, not just from last year, but in Q1 of this year, confirms those projections.
Okay. Deputy Barry.
Thank you, Chair. So I'll start with a question. €276 million paid to landlords last year under HAP. €695 million paid to landlords under a variety of schemes, including RAS. Nearly 700 million. Housing commentators are now saying it's only a matter of time before the subsidy reaches the 1 billion mark. Can the Minister give us his best estimate as to when the subsidy will reach the 1 billion mark?
Thank you, Deputy, for the question. I can't give you an estimate now off the top of my head as to whether or not we will actually get to that amount. What I would say is that the money that we are providing to support people into the private rental sector is absolutely necessary, because if we didn't do that, then those people would find themselves either in emergency accommodation or worse. What I'd also say is that actually we can support far more people in this way at the moment than if we were able to put that money into direct build and know that those buildings will be built overnight we can actually support many more people using the same amount of money. But it is my ambition, and it is the ambition under the plan that we have in front of us, to move to a point in time where in 2021 we'll be accommodating more people, more new people into the stock of social housing than we'll be supporting them into the private rental sector. And then we'll continue with that ambition through beyond Rebuilding Ireland into Project Ireland 2040.
You're not ruling out that the subsidy will reach the 1 billion mark?
I'm not speculating on that at all, Deputy, so I'm not making no comment on that. That's speculation that you're making.
It's not speculation on my behalf, it's speculation on behalf of some of the most serious housing commentators in the city and in the country. And I note the fact that you're not ruling it out either.
You made a point.
In any case, I'll move on with my commentary.
No, if I can answer.
Yeah, you can come back in when he's finished.
Well, it's on that particular point. I mean, what I won't speculate on is the fact that we spent more than €1 billion on new social housing homes last year. That's what we did do last year. The stock of social housing homes, more than €1 billion was spent. So that's a fact if you want a fact, Deputy.
Another fact is that Threshold have produced a report now which says that nearly 50% of HAP tenants are paying top-ups to landlords. The top-ups vary according to Threshold from €20 per month to €575 per month. They say that the average top-up is €177 per month, and that in urban areas and just outside urban areas that the average is closer to €300 per month. They note the fact that 45% of people that they've surveyed say that these top-ups contribute to them really struggling to pay utility bills, groceries, childcare and school costs. Chairman, landlords are creaming it in this country and they're being facilitated by the Minister and his policies. But the main point I want to deal with is the question of co-living. So we've had a huge controversy about this recently. The idea that the Minister's co-living guidelines could potentially allow for a situation where up to 42 people would be sharing kitchen facilities and sleeping in cubicles that would be smaller than the size of a disabled parking space. Co-living has been described by the Minister as an exciting opportunity for young workers, but it has been described by Threshold as opening the door to 21st century bedsits. And I think other serious commentators have raised the prospect of 21st century tenements around this. Co-living has an interesting history. It actually, you know, in its modern guise, it began as a form of housing pioneered in the 1930s in England by people who had a radical social intent in the period between the wars, an idea of communal living, an idea which went against the laissez-faire market policies of the time, which allowed for tenants to have democratic control over their own living quarters, and fed into the idea of the welfare state after the war because it promoted the idea of housing as a universal right. However, this progressive idea has been completely and utterly turned on its head by big business and corporate interests in recent times, particularly in the United States and in Britain, and is very much part of the commodification of housing. The idea that's been promoted by the Minister and some of his colleagues in government that it might allow for a cheaper alternative accommodation for people is knocked in the head, I think, by the idea of €1,300 rent that's linked with one particular planning application at the moment. And I'm asking the Minister to comment on Threshold's proposition that in reality what he is doing here is opening the door to 21st century bedsits.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the question. So in relation to the first area that you raised and in relation to the housing assistance payment, so yes, top-ups are allowed, but 3 out of 4 tenants in a HAP situation are not paying the top-up. And of course, we also have discretion for the local authorities to give up to 20% of their own top-up from the local authority where it's necessary, so that the tenant wouldn't be put in a situation where they couldn't afford a top-up, but more rent would be required because of the demands that are there in the market. allowing that kind of flexibility, I think, is very important because it can be to the benefit of the tenant being able to secure a property where they want to live. The vast majority of people who are availing of the housing assistance payment, the vast majority, are doing so successfully. They enjoy the flexibility that it gives that previous schemes did not give in terms of being able to work more and earn more. And they also enjoy the fact that they can have flexibility over where the accommodation is. And from our own point of view, as a policy point of view, notwithstanding the fact that we want to be providing more homes into the social housing stock, HAP allows us to do something with existing housing stock in terms of achieving a social mix, which we wouldn't do if we didn't have the scheme in place. So HAP will always be there to a degree, less of a degree than it is now, but it will always be there to a degree because there are social benefits to it, both for the person using HAP as well as the state's perspective on the kind of mix that we want to see in housing. You talk about landlords, Deputy, but earlier on you were looking for more landlords in the long-term rental sector. So I'd just ask for some consistency there. And I really think it's not helping anyone. It's not serving a mature debate in this area for you to try and speak about a landlord class when 70% of landlords in this country only own one property. They're families, they're individuals. You are trying to paint them as something which they are not. I think it's grossly unfair. And in relation to this issue, stepping back from it, arrears, people having difficulty paying rent, whether it is the top of or something else, is an issue. In fact, the RTB think it's more of an issue than the serving of notices to quit when the reason is for sale of property. And that's why my department and the RTB, together with some of the leading NGOs, together with the DRHE, are trying to get further information on this to see what further interventions can be made. And I've discussed it with the Minister for Social Protection, this particular issue of arrears, and it's also being discussed at the interagency group, which is the cross-agency, departmental agency and government body group that I set up in September of 2017. And it's also been discussed at a special meeting with the Taoiseach and other relevant ministers as to how we make sure that we're making earlier interventions to help people who find themselves in difficulty or in housing insecurity. Because the earlier the intervention we make, the less chance there is of someone actually having to present to the local authority or to enter into emergency accommodation. So it's a big piece of work that we're doing there. In relation to co-living, of course I cannot comment on an individual planning application. I don't remember, Deputy, you making any objection to this proposal when it was first brought forward by me 14 months ago when the regulations were brought into law last year. You note a view given by Threshold. I will note a view given by the Irish architects who welcomed it as part of a way of providing another layer or element of choice in the housing sector that we have. So there are different views on this. It's a small aspect of what we need to do, a very small aspect. Less than 1% of new builds in the next 12 months will be for co-living. It isn't for everyone, but in the same way, a 4-bedroom house share for someone coming to this country for the first time isn't for everyone, nor is living in isolation in a studio or a 1-bed apartment. That's not for everyone either. It's a small element of what we need to do. But of the more than 20,000 new builds that will happen this year, I don't know if any will be for co-living, in fact. But over the next 12 months, if it does happen, it'll be for less than 1%. And just, if I can be clear on this, it seems to me, given the historical outline that you've given, that you welcome the concept of co-living. That would be what I would take from the comments that you made as you talked through the idea of the concept. And again, we can't talk about an individual planning application here. Chair.
Jennifer, sorry.
Thank you, Minister. And I suppose my concerns would be, and we've all been out canvassing in the last few months, you could say, between local elections and European elections, and I'd say housing, Minister, was the biggest issue at the door. There's no point in saying different. Well, I wait till you're finished, Minister. I know you're like, no, that's fine. No, you're fine. No, it's grand. But look, just to say that, like, I know at the doors, and I'm sure your own colleagues, Minister, would have said, I felt, and I'm sure I know some of my other colleagues have said, housing came up at every door. There's not a door that housing didn't come up. And now, in fairness, I did say that as part of a housing committee group, we work extremely hard, and the work that was being done, I don't think yet has come to fruition, but I do think in the next while it will. But there was concerns, and I took in everyone's concerns, and I said, look, I will go back to the Minister. One of the biggest issues in my own area, Minister, which came across all the time, and I know I've said this, and I know I keep on about this, but it's so important, is that the threshold has to be changed for local authorities. In my own area, it's been 8 years since it has been changed, and we now have a situation again. As I said, we are one of the lowest qualifying to go on the local authority housing at 27,500 for a family, when you have neighbouring counties like Laois and them up 32,000. But last week there was bedlam, or a few weeks back in Carlow, where you have neighbours now, because we are going at the AHPs, which I'll bring up to you in a minute again, and you have neighbours from Carlow and Laois beside each other, neighbours. And because Carlow County Council's cap on your rent is 180 per week, and you have Laois is €93 per week. So you now have people that are earning the same amount of money in a housing estate, paying triple what the neighbour next door is paying, and it actually becomes a massive issue. And now it actually has, like, they were on the radio, I was on the radio and I was saying, look, I will go back to the Minister, but it's huge when you have someone maybe bringing in €500 a week, and one particular house is paying nearly double the amount for the same house, because you're in two different local authorities, even though you're sharing the same, because we border like Carlow Laois. So it's just something I really feel we need to look at. And then that's just two areas, maybe, Minister, you could come back to me. And the other area I just feel we're falling down on, and Minister, like, again, I know, and you have a lot of my concerns, you have been very fair and come back to me on, is, like, yesterday I had a lady, now I didn't know the lady, well, I know her, but I didn't realise she was going on the radio, and they had to take her off our local radio because they thought she was actually going to have a panic attack, where the house she's in has been sold and she couldn't find a home, and the council and no one was helping her. And now I have been speaking to her since, but I just feel that we're coming across a lot of these situations where people feel they're not getting the help. Now again, I think I nearly have it sorted, and I think the council have, but I just think we need to, I think there's loads of more cases like this that are that we're not going on radios to highlight it, but we shouldn't have to go on a radio to highlight it, and I think that's unfortunate. But I just think, I feel that there needs to be more, whether it's through local authorities, more cases under hardship needs to be recognised, and they're not doing that. And I'm just saying, maybe it's an area going forward we need to look at that as well. The other thing I wanted to ask you about was the AHPs, and I know in paragraph 2.15 you have said that we will establish a regulator for the AHP sector to oversee the effective governance and financial management of voluntary and cooperative housing bodies. Now, I've said this to you, Minister, in the Senate, I think this is what's happening going forward. Like, I have two cases now, Minister, that I have given to you where builders have been working with different agencies. And I'm talking, there's 130 houses being built here between the two of these, and the local authorities have to consider, will they look at these houses? And these are excellent builders, give excellent housing, and it worries me that we don't have a regulator there that should say, look, you have so many people on your local authority housing list, and the HAP has come up again, and what it's costing the country. Look, we need HAP because people need to be in rented accommodation, but there has to be a system where the AHPs can go to, whether they're working through the builders and back to the local authorities. I mean, everything, as you know, has to be above board and everything's right, and that's something that I would stand for. But when you have builders and you have people saying, look, I'm working with the AHPs and the council are telling me they're looking at it, that's unacceptable when you could have that amount of houses. So what I'm asking you is, going forward, Minister, will you push, or what is the update for a regulator for this? Because I believe from other neighbouring counties that all these different AHPs are actually going to provide a massive service to local authority, and it's taking people off local authority housing lists. So I think that is one of the biggest issues going forward. And just to say, look, I would appreciate that you would come back to me with answers to changing to the qualifying to go on the local authority lists, and I think it needs to be done badly. But these are just areas that I would have massive concerns about. Thank you, Minister.
Chair, thank you, Senator. And if I might just at the outset, thank you very much for your help last week in the Senate in getting through the rent bill, because while we had an excellent debate and discussion, not all of the senators are on this committee, and they wouldn't have been aware of the amount of time that we had taken with that bill. And so the remarks that you made were helpful in clarifying that and other issues. So we were able to meet the timelines that we put in place for ourselves. So thank you for that. Housing should be coming up on doors as we knock on doors as representatives ourselves or during a campaign, because it's an issue that's affecting everyone. I know that some people try to present in this House that it's an issue that affects only those whom they claim to represent, but that's not the case. The housing pressures that we have in this country affect everyone, either directly in their own housing situation or a very close loved one, be it a child or an elderly relative. And so we have to continue to drive Rebuilding Ireland, this plan, through to its successful conclusion, and make those changes where we need to make changes, if they're smart changes to make, and review what we're doing all the time as we're doing today. And one of the things that we are doing at the moment is a review of social housing qualification, income thresholds, differential rents, not inheritancy, but succession rights into accommodation where someone's parent might have been living there, etc. All of these things are being looked at because we are dramatically increasing the stock of social housing. That is happening from different streams. So it's an important time as we increase the stock to see what changes we need to make sure that it's fair. Because what you were speaking to there was fairness in terms of the rents that are being paid. And so some of this work has been led by the housing agency, so it's to a degree outside of my hands in terms of the thresholds. Other work my department is liaising with local authorities on. And what I'm hoping to do is to bring a kind of a suite of reforms together to say this is what the new landscape will look like from 6 months hence, if you like. So that piece of work has been worked on at the moment. It is secondary, perhaps, if I may, to what we're trying to do with affordable housing at the moment, because we're right now trying to get all of the pieces of our affordable programme in place. The sites, the schemes, the priority schemes. So that's kind of where we're at the moment in terms of what we're looking at and some work that I want to do later this month. But in tandem, we have been progressing. A lot of the work's already done. It's been going on for quite some time. But we're just hoping to bring it to completion, I hope, before the dole rises. So I can have a session in here with you before we do. But if not, then when we get back at the beginning of September. So that will look at those things that you've raised around differential rents, around income thresholds. And in relation to AHBs, there's two important things to note here. So your colleague beside you asked about the regional workshops in his intervention earlier on. It's this cooperation between AHBs and local authorities. It's happening very well in some areas. It happens very well with certain AHBs, but it should be. We shouldn't see local authorities and AHBs competing for a site. We shouldn't see AHBs and AHBs competing for a site, nor should we see local authorities losing out on a particular site. So the workshops are trying to identify better cooperation and try and work towards that. I have to say, from my experience to date, it's been very, very strong. But we have had a voluntary regulatory code in place since 2014. We will have, I think, pre-legislative scrutiny. We've already had pre-legislative scrutiny on the bill. We will publish the bill for regulation, statutory regulation of the AHB sector. Very shortly, and that will be the provision for an actual statutory regulator of the AHB sector. So the housing agency actually does this work for the voluntary regulation. They have a good chunk of the Tier 3 AHBs already under their code, but not all of them. But that work that's been done means we won't be starting from a standing position. A lot has already happened. We'll be able to move, I think, quite smoothly from voluntary regulation into statutory regulation once the bill is passed.
Sorry, Catherine, but I want to just compliment one of your staff and all your staff, but particularly Lawrence Keating has been just excellent. I have gone to him with several issues and he has come back, and even just for clarification. So I just think it's important when people do good work, they should be recognised. So just well done to him. He's very good, like the rest of your staff, but he's particularly very helpful and very good to give me information. So I just think it's important to give him a mention. Thank you.
Deputy Cullinan.
Mary Hurley, stop talking to you now.
Deputy Cullinan. Would Deputy Cullinan's substitution for Deputy O'Brien?
I normally see the staff at the Public Accounts Committee, but I'm happy to talk to them here as well. Minister, the homeless figures are just up again, 10,378. You keep saying that rebuilding Ireland is working. How can that chime with the latest figures which have again come out showing an increase in homelessness? And can you first of all react to the figures which have been just published?
Thank you, Deputy, and you're very welcome to this morning's session of the committee. The figures are just out for the previous month, for April, and they are up, as you pointed out, which is very, very disappointing. We continue to increase the stock of social housing. We continue to see housing delivery generally across the economy ramping up quite significantly and sustainably, which is important as well. We're seeing now moderation in house prices, which I think is a good thing. And we've changed the laws around rent pressure zones, which will still take some time to take effect. So it is hugely disappointing to see the numbers up again. We have seen a decrease in the number of families and children in emergency accommodation month on month. It's a small decrease, but it's still a decrease. And what we have seen in the first 4 months of this year is over 320 families leaving emergency accommodation. So it's important to point out that while, yes, there are more people now in emergency accommodation than there were in the previous month, people are exiting all the time. Families are getting out of emergency accommodation into homes, more than 320 in the first 4 months of this year. And another important thing, I think, is that for every 2 families that came into homeless services and might have gone into emergency accommodation, 1 family we actually found a home for before they had to go into emergency accommodation. And that speaks to the huge level of work that is going on in local authorities and with the NGOs in actually preventing families from having to go into emergency accommodation. And roughly now, for every family that did go into emergency accommodation last month, a family exited. So there's a huge amount happening. The NGOs that work with us do a fantastic job. We do the work through the NGOs. We're spending over 120 million, I think, on emergency accommodation this year and those types of services because we recognise that they're the experts. But it is still a very big challenge that we are facing. There's no doubt about that.
You use words like ramping up and acceleration when it comes to new social and public housing build. It's a crawl at best, and the evidence is before your eyes with these figures that we can't, on the one hand, say that Rebuilding Ireland is a success. We're building more houses. We have this ramping up, ratcheting up, as you put it, and yet we get these figures month on month, quarter by quarter, showing an increase in the number of people who are homeless. There are a number of aspects to Rebuilding Ireland that I want to focus on very quickly. Affordable homes, affordable cost rental are almost non-existent. You keep telling us again that we are going to see progress in these areas. People don't see it. There obviously has to be a focus on social housing. In my own constituency, the figures for Rebuilding Ireland, the targets for Rebuilding Ireland are woefully unambitious. What you're missing is that there's more people coming onto the lists, housing lists, than coming off, because we're building so few homes. So there's no evidence of any ratcheting up in the city and the county where I live, that's for sure. So you need to understand that unless you build more homes for people, we're going to keep coming into rooms like this and having these conversations about rising homeless figures. And we're going to keep having the same conversations in the Dáil chamber and outside the Dáil chamber. So can I ask about your plan for co-living and the comments that you made in advance of the Raise the Roof rally, which I want to commend trade unions and political parties, progressive parties on the left, and those who mobilised for that campaign to demand better housing for people and more houses. You said this was a choice for people. For the best part, people who will be forced, in my view, into these co-living don't see it as an option or a choice. It certainly won't be a choice for the privileged. It certainly won't be a choice for people who are doing well. And you said you don't want to comment on any individual application, planning application. That's fair enough. Is it acceptable to you that in one of these co-living options, hypothetically, that the average rent would be €1,300 a month? Can I ask you first, would that be acceptable to you in one of these co-living options, a bed sit? And would it be acceptable to you that we could have up to 40 people or more sharing a kitchen on one floor? Would that be acceptable to you? Would that be something that you would want to see one of your family members be put into? I certainly would not. So these are not choices that people have. It's not what they aspire to. It's just the reality that they have no other option because you won't provide the alternatives. So can you answer those 2 questions for me? Is it acceptable that €1,300 a month for a bed sit, one of these co-living options, is something that you could stand over, and 42 or more people sharing a kitchen? Is that acceptable to you?
Okay, thank you, Deputy.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy. And I think it's important when we have these conversations that we stick to fact as well, Deputy, and that we try and step away from broad brushstroke representations of something that isn't exactly necessarily the truth. So when we... Deputy, you're very welcome to this committee. You weren't here earlier on when I answered some of your initial questions, so I'm going to go back over them. We've been a very good working committee over the last 2 years, with a very respectful tone in this committee. So please don't take the disrespect that you show in the Dáil chamber into this committee.
I don't show any disrespect in the Dáil chamber, and just through the chair, I haven't shown you any disrespect at all.
You haven't let me answer one question yet, Deputy.
I've asked you to clarify. You accused me of putting misinformation to you, and I'm saying clarify it. That's not disrespectful.
So
just let the Minister answer then, and we can have a second round if you need it.
Rebuilding Ireland is a work in progress. It's a 5-year plan, but it is working. And the reason that I can say it is working is because of the increases that we're seeing in the supply of new homes. If you look at the increase in the number of new builds built this year in the first quarter, evidence that we have from the CSO, independent of the department, in terms of new buildings completed and new buildings commencing on site. We are seeing a very quick but also sustainable increase in the number of new homes being built. And before we talk about any other challenges that we face in housing, if we are not correcting fundamentally supply, we can't solve those other challenges. So at least we know that the fundamental problem here is being addressed through Rebuilding Ireland, which I think is important. You talk about a rapid increase in the stock of social housing. Since the year before Rebuilding Ireland was started, we've seen an 8-fold increase in the stock of social housing. I think it's like 8-fold, which is huge when you think about it. And it is significant. And it can't be dismissed as not social housing or not a commitment to social housing or not an increase, because it is. We have an ambition for 50,000 new homes into the stock of social housing over the period of Rebuilding Ireland, which is also very, very significant and very, very ambitious. The first cost rental project will go on site next month. The first affordability project will go on site next month. So all of the work that we have done here in the planning and the preparation will now begin to bear fruit in either affordable homes or cost rental homes, just like all of the work that we did in social housing and gearing up and making reforms and making changes is now bearing fruit in the increase of social housing. You talk about the housing list increasing. That is not a fact. The housing list, in fact, has gone down to somewhere just over 70,000 people on the housing list. In your own area of Waterford, since 2016, it's fallen from 1,596 to 1,117. So we are seeing progress in Rebuilding Ireland. When people say Rebuilding Ireland is not working, I understand that they look at what's happening in emergency accommodation. I understand their frustration, they're angry and they're upset because the numbers are increasing. But they have to recognise that other significant parts of Rebuilding Ireland, increasing the supply, making important changes in planning guidelines, fast-track processes, the reforms that we've made around the rental sector, that those things are having some impact. But because this is a 5-year plan, we have to continue to drive those reforms and make new ones where they prove necessary. In relation to co-living, I did address this earlier with another member of the committee, but I'll repeat because you've asked the same questions. So the guidelines are quite clear in terms of what was published at the time and what was welcomed by many, many sectors, from architects to others, in terms of providing another piece in our new housing sector which we are building. If you look at the tens of thousands of new homes that we've built over the next 12 months, less than 1%, easily less than 1%, will be for co-living. So this is not about replacing homes or apartments with co-living. It's about adding a small addition where some people might want to have that choice, because not everyone coming to this country will want to move into a 4-bed flat with people they don't know. At the same time, they won't want to live in isolation in a single studio. And they might also want to make sacrifices so that they might want access to a gym or these types of things. That's for them. But the problem that we have at the moment is people across this country do not have choice in their housing situation. And by increasing supply, we're trying to increase that choice, and about different types of supply. Accommodation for the elderly, apartments for families, homes for families, student accommodation, and yes, co-living, which will be a small part of it. And the concept has been welcomed by many. And I have said I cannot speak on an individual planning application, so I won't.
Well, I'm not asking you to speak. And no, he hasn't answered the questions that put.
Sorry, Deputy, the time is up. We're moving on. If you can stay around for the second round, you're entitled to come back again. I'm moving on to Deputy Barry.
10,378 people officially homeless. The numbers are up again. Traditionally, normally, what happens is that you have an increase in the homeless numbers at the start of the year. After the Christmas period, numbers tend to go up in January, numbers tend to go up in February. Normally, traditionally, in the past, the numbers tend to go down again in March, April, May, coming through the spring into the summer. But that's not happening here. It's not happening here, Minister. They're going up month on month. So, my first two questions. Do you believe that a minister who allows this to happen, that this happens on their watch, deserves to remain in office? Do you believe that a government that allows this to happen. More than 10,000 of our people officially homeless, with the numbers going up coming into the spring. That a government that allows that to happen deserves to remain in power. I have one other question for you, but I'll pause for now to hear your response to those questions.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Deputy, for the questions. Yeah, I mean, as I said earlier on, we have seen an increase on the last month of 73 in emergency accommodation. We have seen a decrease of 4 families, and we've also seen a decrease of 27 children. Small decreases, but decreases nonetheless. The numbers go up and down each month in different categories and in different parts of the country. That's why I've said before the monthly reporting isn't very helpful in terms of understanding the reasons behind each individual and each family either entering or being prevented or exiting. And that's why I said this morning that we'll continue to publish the numbers on a monthly basis, but we're reporting on a quarterly basis in more detail now, so that we can have a better analysis of exactly what is happening. And I also mentioned, as it's going to be an independent piece of research done separate from my department, we're just finalising the draft terms of reference for that research, so that we can look at what's happening with adults, adult individuals and families in greater detail, not just in terms of those who present and are prevented, but those who enter, and then what their pathway to exit is and what that looks like and how sustainable that is, because it's a piece of work that needs to be done as well. You know, it's hugely disappointing to see the numbers up again. And I think that it's unfair, though, to try and characterise that as either local authorities or the NGOs not doing a huge amount of work in that same period. As I said earlier, in the first quarter of this year, more than 320 families left emergency accommodation at homes, which is really important. So when we see the numbers going up, it's not the same people necessarily in emergency accommodation. Last year, more than 5,000 adults were prevented from entering or exited emergency accommodation. In the first 4 months of this year, for every 2 families that presented into homeless services, 1 was prevented from entering emergency accommodation and 1 entered emergency accommodation. So that shows you the huge amount of work that is happening. And also at the same time, roughly, looking just at last month, for every family that entered emergency accommodation, another family was leaving. What that tells us is that things like family hubs, which is a new support, are getting families out of emergency accommodation more quickly. What it tells us is that supports that we are using, from the housing assistance payment to the increase in social housing stock, is working to get families out of emergency accommodation. But as we continue to see things, for example, like landlords exiting the market, we're going to see continuing pressures on housing insecurity. And I think that's very challenging. And I think our responsibility as legislators is to try and bring forward solutions that have the support of this House and that will make important changes to help people, like what we saw in the rent bill that we agreed as an Oireachtas committee last week. We finalised it. That's an important change that will help people, and that's how we try and fix this situation and do better. Deputy, that's the approach that we have taken as a government, and that's the support that I've had from this committee on those measures that they've been able to support. There are differences on policy, of course there are. There must be in a democracy. Rebuilding Ireland is a work in progress, as I have said. It is showing very strong results in areas like supply, but in areas like homelessness, despite the huge amount of money that has been spent, despite all the extra resources that have been put in place, we continue to have this very, very big challenge. But we continue to do a huge amount of work to get families out of emergency accommodation or prevent them from entering.
Do you deserve to remain in office? Does the government deserve to remain in power in the light of these horrific figures?
Deputy, personalising this to me is not going to help one family that's struggling in housing insecurity today, or one young couple that's trying to buy a home, or even pay their rent or pay their bills. You might be better off in trying to bring forward solutions that will get the support of other colleagues in this House, because if you can, then they'll be supported by this government, because we are a minority. You can change the law, Deputy. That's the power that you have as the legislator. So please, bring forward the things that you think can help me get families out of emergency accommodation more quickly, and I will happily support them.
Do the government deserve to remain in power?
To that question, I'll give you the previous answer that I just gave.
It's nothing to do with personalising it.
Well,
do the government deserve to remain in power? There's more than 10,000 people officially homeless. The numbers are going up once again on your watch. Do you think you deserve to remain in power?
So I'm going to assume then from that question that you believe that you should be in power. And so I would love to see your ambitious programme of 100 to 200 different actions under a cohesive, progressive piece of work that will do more than what we're doing now. Where is your coalition of people and where is your coalition of ideas, Deputy? Because what you were saying in asking that question is that you believe you will do a better job at this, and that, not more than that, you have both the popular support from the public to get TD seats in, or you have other parties in this Dáil who will coalesce with you on this issue. And not just this issue, but every other issue in government. So stop playing to the gallery with these questions. And let's move on to actually getting into the detail of rebuilding Ireland, please.
Final question.
Okay.
My final question is, if the 10,378 people who are officially homeless, if they were here across from you this morning, or a group of them were here across from you in this committee room this morning, and they're saying, we are in emergency accommodation, we are homeless, we want to see change, we don't want to see it next year, in 6 months' time, we want to see a change in our lives over the next weeks, over the next months, what would you say to them?
Well, Deputy, I mean, there are more than 10,378 people who are homeless, because that number is the number of people in emergency accommodation. It doesn't count the people who are sleeping rough, because that's a whole separate challenge. The number of people sleeping rough. So this is the number of people who are not in any type of emergency. The problem is even worse than that, yeah. This is people who are not in any type of emergency accommodation, and that number has fallen, which is welcome. So there are a number of people who are facing a very, very challenging situation. And there are, of course, people who are in housing insecurity, who don't know where the next place they're going to live is, should they get served a notice to quit. There are also people who have moved back in with their parents because they're struggling to find a place to live as well. And what I would say to all of them is that the government is working night and day to further progress rebuilding Ireland, to get more homes built, and to do things like what we have done this morning, which is effectively commence the regulation, limit a short-term letting from our major rent pressure zones. What we did last week was finalise major reforms to our rental sector that are going to introduce rent caps to more areas, that are going to extend the timing of rent caps, that are going to give people who are in housing insecurity much more time in terms of the notice to quit when it is served, to find other accommodation. It's also going to allow the TB to chase up rogue landlords where they are stepping outside of the law or in breach of the law, and a whole lot of other things that are going to help people now in the rental sector, including for the first time regulating loads of larger landlords whom, because they brought new properties to the market in the last 2 years, weren't previously covered by them. And for people in emergency accommodation, I continue to engage week in, week out with the NGOs, with the local authorities. We have increased the funding for this year for emergency accommodation. We've increased the number of placeholders. We continue to roll out the housing assistance payment. And all of these things are helping people. Not enough, Deputy, not enough. But 320-something families, I think it was 329, left emergency accommodation in the first 4 months of this year because of work that local authorities are doing with NGOs supported by my department. In the first 4 months of this year, for every 2 families that presented to homelessness, one of those families went into emergency accommodation, one of those went into a home. So a huge amount is happening, and more will continue as we continue to increase the stock of social housing and continue to put in those other supports that need to be delivered. And Deputy, if you have any additional idea that can help those people, because you're a representative too, please bring it forward, look for the support of the House, and you'll be able to get it through, and we can get to work on it.
Deputy O'Brien.
Thanks very much, Chair. First of all, look, I just want to thank the Minister for corresponding with the Lucan Community College Amnesty International students. I presented to the Minister with a series of petitions that the students had collected on foot of a sleep out that they did recently, and all of the local TDs attended. I might suggest, given the really good work of that group, Minister, and this is a genuine suggestion, you might invite them in to meet you and talk through some of the things that they discussed with us as members of the committee, or sorry, members of the Oireachtas in the constituency, because they had some very powerful and real-life experiences that I think you would benefit from hearing. I have a couple of specific questions, but I just want to respond to what I've heard so far. Rebuilding Ireland, in my opinion, and the Minister knows this, isn't working. And let me deal specifically with the arguments that the Minister made to justify his claim that it is. He talked about supply was finally being delivered. You are way behind on the central Rebuilding Ireland supply target of an average of 25,000 home completions a year over the lifetime of the plan, substantially behind it. Yes, there was 18,000 completions last year. I welcome every single one of those. But that is not what is in your plan. And in order to meet that central objective of the plan, we're probably going to have to hit 30,000 completions this year and higher than that next year and the year after. So I think it is unfortunate that you're presenting missed targets as significant progress. And I think most independent observers, and you're right, the CSO data is absolutely spot on, but most independent observers know that you're way behind target. I also think your position on the monthly report is disappointing. You're absolutely right, it doesn't give us the background detail that many of us have been asking for quite some time, but it does give us a point-in-time way of tracking the trend. And while I appreciate you weren't Minister at the time when the monthly reporting was agreed, some of the strongest advocates of that monthly reporting were academics and homeless service providers, because they realised the value of, in addition to having more in-depth quarterly reports, the value of having that point-in-time tracker, because it does give valuable information. We're one of only 2 member states in the European Union, as far as I know, that have it, and we shouldn't underestimate its value. It doesn't do the other stuff you're talking about. It was never meant to do that. And when you publish those more detailed quarterly reports, I welcome it, because, for example, we don't know today the average length of time a family spends in emergency accommodation. We have some of that information from Dublin City Council, but we don't have it statewide. We don't have, for example, information on whether an exit, as you describe it, from homelessness is somebody leaving emergency accommodation or somebody being prevented from going into emergency accommodation through access to Homeless Hat before the notice to quit expires. And they're important things that we need to understand, and the sooner we get that information, the better. You talked about an 8-fold increase in social housing, and you know, I said this to Damien English during the right to housing debate. Our party, other parties can speak for themselves, but our party aren't saying that no social housing is being delivered. What we're saying is it is nowhere near enough. And 8-fold sounds impressive, except for when you realise that there was virtually nothing 8 years ago, and therefore 8 times nothing isn't particularly impressive in real terms. David Cullinane is right. Real social housing need in his county and every county in the country is increasing, because we define real social housing need as those people in need of real, permanent, secure, long-term social housing tenancies, properties owned by the approved housing body, sector or local government. So when you add up those people on housing lists and in HAP, 2-year insecure tenancies, the numbers are significantly increasing. What's also particularly concerning is the number of new households entering onto the local authority housing list every year is greater than the number of real social housing units being delivered, by your own figures. It's about 14,000 households came onto the list last year, and the total for real social housing was in and around 7,000. So you're neither catching up with existing need nor catching up with new need either. And I have to say, to describe yet another increase in the homeless figures as disappointing, like, it's not disappointing. It is deeply, deeply concerning that despite all of the actions that are listed and all of the work of your officials and the officials in the local authority and the approved housing bodies, these figures continue to go in the wrong direction. And I just think that's so concerning that to use words like disappointing, I just don't think gets the gravity of it. The opposition has had a range of things passed, actually, and you continue to ignore them. After, for example, the scandal was revealed by RT Investigates Nightmare to Let, a motion was passed through this Dáil with cross-party support in the opposition, recommending a range of measures for improving the private rental sector. Every single party on the opposition bench has supported it. You've acted on none of those things. October 3rd last, there was a very significant motion passed with a range of policy alternatives, and you've set your face against almost all of those. So, while you have responded to some of the things opposition members and this committee has done, and I acknowledge that, short-term letting and the strengthened powers for the RTB, they are at the periphery. So I want to respond to all of those points. My questions are as follows. I'm very concerned that we still don't have the full rollout of the National Quality Standards Framework and inspections of all emergency accommodation, both voluntary and private, and that the inspections that are currently taking place are not independent. And I'd ask you if you can respond to whether at any stage we're going to have fully independent inspections of all emergency accommodation. I'm growing increasingly concerned at what I'm hearing about the entry rents for the cost rental. Originally, it was meant to be $1,600 a month, I'm told, in Dunleary, Rathdown. It's now down to $1,200 or $1,300, way, way above the affordability of people who need much of this accommodation. But also, these projects are taking far, far too long, and I'd like you to give us updates on each of the individual projects, Enniskerry Road, St Michael's, and the others. On the co-living issue, I'd have no difficulty with co-living if there was a way of ensuring that the idea that upwardly mobile professionals who for short periods of time wanted to live in that kind of accommodation could be controlled. My worry is short-term investors will build this stuff. It will start as the kind of accommodation you describe. Those short-term investors will flip to take advantage of generous tax incentives that your government introduced, and then those developments will become slums or tenements in the future. That's my big concern. So my specific question to you, Minister, is how will you prevent that from happening? Not whether or not you agree with a particular planning application. How do we prevent these things from, at a later stage when they're sold on, from becoming substandard accommodation for people with no choices? On the approved housing bodies, again, I am really, really concerned that there is very, very little evidence of progress between your department and the Department of Finance on the reclassification of the approved housing bodies, and that is going to have an impact on government balance sheet and the ability of that sector to deliver into the future. And then two final questions, Chair. We heard from your officials at one of our earlier meetings that the near zero energy building regulations are going to come out quite soon, and very disappointingly that they won't include a targeted phase-out date for gas boilers. I would urge you to reconsider that. I know there's issues around skills in the marketplace at present, but I think those regulations have to have a phase-out target date, preferably of 2021, for gas boilers if we're to meet our climate change targets. And then finally, on the rental stock, as you know, according to the Residential Tenancies Board, since January 2017, we've lost 12 or 13,000 rental properties. And we need to track the loss of properties, not landlords, because that's what's really important. The vast majority of those, from the information we have, are one-off, accidental, semi-professional landlords who had been stuck in negative equity, and now, because there's positive equity in the market, they're exiting. I don't see or hear anything from you or your officials about how you're going to try and prevent that disorderly exit of those types of properties from the market. I know it's going to be difficult, and I know you're going to tell me that, or I think you're going to tell me that, obviously, increased supply from institutional investors is part of the solution. But what are you going to do to stop that continual exit of those vital properties from the rental market? Because clearly that's one of the key drivers of the increased homeless figures we've seen today.
Chair, thank you, Deputy. Just taking a final note of that. Last question. Sorry. So, Deputy, thank you for bringing that to me from the school students. I couldn't find a Twitter handle. I mean, you asked me to tweet them, but I couldn't find. Maybe they're not on Twitter. I have invited students into the department from time to time to present on various projects that they've done and different things, so I'd be more than happy to do that, have them in and have a talk through their experience of things and how they saw it from their perspective. And I've had a number of schools and students correspond with me on the issue that we have and the crisis that's there in homelessness, and it's great to see that happening, because obviously the educational role, the kind of the civic lessons that are happening in schools are touching upon the most important issues that we face as a society today. So I'm always happy to get that correspondence in and to engage with students on that basis. So when we look at rebuilding Ireland, I mean, you made some political points at the beginning, Deputy, and I'll address those. Like, rebuilding Ireland is a work in progress. It's not something that is going to land and then overnight is going to transform what's happening in housing. It's something that needs to be managed, hence why we have a Department for Housing and a Minister for Housing to manage it through. Some things won't work as well as intended initially. They'll need to be reformed. We've done that in certain areas. But I addressed this issue about supply. It's not behind. I addressed this earlier in terms of our targets. And I think it's unfortunate that you're trying to undermine some of the facts behind the targets, as I think it's clear that you're trying to do. So we remain on target for what we're looking at in Rebuilding Ireland, which is 25,000 new homes this year, and then how that translates through in the period 2017 to 2021 in terms of the overall target of new homes. And we ramp it up again going into Project Ireland 2040, which takes over from Rebuilding Ireland after that. My position on the monthly reports, by the way, is that we'll continue to publish the numbers on a monthly basis, but I want more detailed reporting on a quarterly basis. It's not possible to do that more detailed reporting on a monthly basis. I understand the point you make about month on month having a figure. In and of itself, though, it is only telling us one thing, and it's telling us in the absence of all sorts of other information. And that's why I mentioned two improvements we're going to make: a quarterly report, and then also the independent research that's happening, which will address the other issues that you raised about how long families are spending in emergency accommodation and those other challenges that we face. When I talked about, for the first 4 months of this year, there being 329 exits of families out of emergency accommodation, they were exits, families that were in emergency accommodation and have moved now into homes, which I think is very important. And it does speak to the huge amount of work that is happening every week to help families. We don't have enough social housing homes yet. So when I talk about the increases that we're seeing in the provision of social housing, it's to welcome that we are increasing. And you say that you as a party say, we don't say that we're not building any social housing homes or that the government isn't, but then you say, 8-time improvement minister, 8 times nothing is nothing. So you actually do give the impression that you're saying, or that you believe that nothing is happening. So you can't take those two sides. Social housing, the supply of social housing is increasing. And the point about 8 times is that, well, yes, it's coming from a low base, it is increasing quite dramatically, but we cannot go from nothing happening to 50,000 homes overnight. We can't do it in a year, but we can do it in years. So when people say, oh, in the 1950s we built, thousands of homes, it'll be true when we look back at rebuilding Ireland and we will say, well, in those years we built thousands of homes, but it's not going to happen in 1 or 2 years. The programme that we have and the timelines that we have are clear in terms of increasing the stock of social housing by 50,000 homes over the course of rebuilding Ireland. And in relation to the numbers on the housing list, we have a determination in law for the calculation of the social housing needs assessment. You can't say, well, I don't like that, I'm going to add extra things to it, and so therefore the numbers are going up. Because that's not how this works. We know where we are in terms of a social housing needs assessment perspective, in terms of the numbers, just over 70,000 on the social housing list. The housing assistance payment, which helps people into the private rental sector, is meeting the housing needs of people. And so when people go through HAP into the private rental sector, they are no longer on the list. And it is true for the vast, vast majority of people who are getting that support, that they want that support, that they prefer the flexibility that it gives, so it works for them as a tenant, because they don't want to live in a particular area in a social housing home, if you like. They want to live in a different area in a private rental sector with the HAP support, and that's meeting their housing need. And then also, from a policy point of view, it allows us to achieve a social mix in existing built areas and in newly built areas that we mightn't have been able to achieve. So I think that's very important from a policy perspective. It won't be used to the extent that we have today, not in the future, but it will always be there, I believe, as a component of making sure we can have mix and making sure that tenants can have the flexibility that they might want to have. You talk about my reaction to what's happening in emergency accommodation, and you try and present a picture to people that I don't get the gravity of this. Like, Deputy, stop trying to personalise this to me. You've been doing that for 2 years now, and I'm not sure if you believe that it's working, but all of the feedback that I'm getting from people, and I've gotten over the last weekend, is that it is not. Of course I understand the gravity of this. It's the most pressing issue that we have in society today, and I'm responsible for getting people out of emergency accommodation and preventing them from entering emergency accommodation. If you want to dance on top of me for the use of an individual word, go ahead. I will continue to do my work to help people. I will continue to work with the NGOs and the local authorities, because I've met people in emergency accommodation, I've met people coming out of hotels, I've met people in very, very dire living situations. I've been out with the outreach teams, met people rough sleeping as well. I've also met the people working on the front line who are trying to help these people and who recognise the work that we are doing. And of course we need to do more. But it's not a small thing that where in the first 4 months of this year, where any 2 families presented, at the local authorities and the NGOs were able to get a home for one of those families. And unfortunately not for the other family, and that's what we need to change. But at that same period of time, for every family roughly in April that was entering, another family was exiting. But that's what we need to change as well, that no families are entering emergency accommodation. And that's the work that we're doing and that we continue to do week in, week out, using all of the levers that are available to us. And you talk about having policy alternatives. Yes, you do. In certain areas, you look to tweak or change a policy, or you suggest, well, if we're doing A, why don't we do B on top of it? And I will come back and say why we can't do that. But having proposed changes to aspects of what the government is doing is not an alternative to a comprehensive plan like Rebuilding Ireland, not by a long shot. And where there are good ideas, they get the support of this House. They get the support of this government and my officials as well. And I've welcomed the engagements that we've had offline as a committee in the Department and the Custom House to tease through some of the issues and to see where we can make improvements. And where there are positive suggestions coming from the committee, of course I embrace them. But I can't do everything because I have to think about unintended consequences. And I've made this point recently. People made changes in the recent past to try and improve one thing, accommodation standards, and it had an unintended consequences on people not being able to get secure accommodation. As we look to try and do things around the rental sector, I have to think about other impacts that it might have in relation to landlords. And you talk about the rental stock, and for the last 2 years I've heard Sinn Féin deputies and others hammering landlords, and now you're turning around and saying, what are we going to do about landlords exiting the market? You have to think about that, yes, policy is important, but words can do as much damage as well. The proposals that were brought forward by some deputies in this House did have landlords say, well, that's it, if this gets through into law, I'm not going to be a landlord anymore. And I'm in a position saying it's not going to get through into the law because it doesn't have the popular support of the House, but still it has an impact. You say, what are we doing for landlords? We brought forward 100% mortgage interest relief for landlords in the last budget, and the leader of your party, Mattie McGrath, hammered it. Hammered it. And that's something that we were trying to do to help keep landlords in the sector. And your party hammered it. So you cannot continue to play both sides of this. And yes, we want more institutional investors coming in, larger landlords, the build-to-rent sector. And so I have made changes to the guidelines to help them in. Because when someone is coming in and trying to do that, they're making a long-term play as landlords, 20, 30 years. They're not an independent landlord looking for some sort of capital appreciation on a property which will then exit in 5, 10 or 15 years. It's a much longer, more sustainable commitment. And so that's part of achieving more of a balance as independent, smaller and accidental landlords leave, as is their right, that we are replacing that also with other independent landlords, yes, but also larger institutional landlords as well. In relation to co-living, I'm very glad that you don't have a difficulty with the concept of it. It's important to note that co-living cannot be sold on like individual apartments can be, and that's true too for the build-to-rent sector, so that's one of the protections that are in place in that regard. In relation to the cost rental rents, yes, this is taking a bit longer, but if we were to start a cost rental project and say this is going to be your rent for the next 30 years, and we found 10 years in that the financial modelling was incorrect, that would actually force hundreds of thousands of people into housing insecurity. So we have to make sure that we are thinking on the long-term time horizon here. That's why the European Investment Bank is now doing a very detailed piece of analysis in relation to costings. The NDFA have done their own as well. We also have a piece of work, and I've seen it for certain sites, where we are looking at, say, the entry-level point of someone in the public service and in different other jobs, and what their rent might be, and does that equate to 1/3 of their disposable income? And yes, it does, and that's what we're trying to lock into the modelling that we're doing around that. In relation to the quality standards framework, the pilot is now complete. We're going to roll that out over the next 12 months. My recent engagement with the Ombudsperson for Children, I spoke about this in detail. It's a very good framework. It's been developed with the experts in the sectors, the NGOs. And I'm not against independent inspections at a future date, but I want to get the quality standards framework in place first and then see what we do around that area, and that's what I communicated to the Ombudsperson. But the priority now is to get that quality standards framework out across the country over the next 12 months. In relation to AHBs, the Department of Finance is leading on the accounting treatment when it comes to our balance sheet of AHBs. Not all of the large AHBs have been counted as per the CSO and Eurostat decision, so this is more complex than how they all just been put on balance sheet. We have received proposals from representatives of the sector as to how we can work around getting them off balance sheet. It's been led by the Department of Finance. It is not hindering development to date, and I'm working to ensure that it doesn't hinder any future investment in AHBs as we seek to include AHBs more in the delivery of social housing and other forms of housing as well. In relation to NZEBs and gas boilers are actually phasing themselves out in and of themselves. We've seen a decrease, I think, of something like 30% in the use of gas boilers in homes over the last couple of years. I've got more precise statistics on this because at the moment I'm engaged with Richard Bruton on the climate action plan that the government is bringing forward in a couple of weeks about how we make sure that as we introduce NZ buildings and passive buildings and other things, that we're also making sure that we are reducing gas boiling. Gas boilers being used as a solution, which is already happening in itself, but as we do that, that we have a pipeline for supply for alternatives and supply and maintenance as well, and that is happening.
Both sides have gone nearly 5
sorry,
minutes
so
over
that's,
time.
sorry, that was the last question to answer in that round. So
okay. Senator Jennifer.
That's it. Thank you, Cairg, and thank you, Minister. I suppose, like other speakers, we are all worried about homeless figures, and it is a massive concern. I would say that there's issues there that I feel we need to address more. But again, look, I know that all of us here has said this to you on numerous occasions, that more needs to be done for people in homeless accommodation. But even just, I feel that, like even at the moment now, just another example of people that are coming to me that are not even qualifying to go on the housing list. And these are people that are on FIS, Family Income Supplement. And they're not qualifying, and there's a lot of that across the country, Minister. So maybe long term we need to put another area of people that are just barely over the threshold. There has to be, Minister, I think, a hardship case put in. At the moment, if you're €10 over to qualify to go on local authority housing list, there's no discretion. You can't. You can go into the department, you can say, look, that has to be changed. When you have a genuine family minister that is just maybe 10 or 20 euros over the cap, they're being told. So maybe that would be something. And I think that's actually another area of people that we're not addressing. And it is becoming a massive issue. It's going to be probably, I feel, a bigger issue going forward. And I was just looking at your, or the department's average monthly rent payment. Like if you look at Carlow, 554, the cheapest house you'll get in Carlow now is €1,000 a month. And what is actually happening is we are now into another area where people, as you know, you can pay the balance now. With the HAP now, years ago when people were on the rent supplement, you could never say, well, they could never say how much the house was costing. Now you can and whatever. But what I'm finding is people are actually have less and less income coming in because they are now paying a massive amount to the landlord back because the HAP is not sufficient. And it's just an area, look, it's an area that needs to be looked at, and it's absolutely becoming very, I'm shocked at the moment at the amount of people that are coming to me that are actually in that position. So it's just another area we need to look at. Homeless is huge, I'm really concerned about that. But the other area, and I want to know about the funding, Minister, is, and I would always call it local authority mortgages, because I know, and in fairness, you have in your department have made this a massive priority, and it has a massive uptake. But I'm just wondering, I have a lot of people still that are going to apply for this. I have a lot of people that are in the system waiting for it. So I'm just wondering, what way is the funding on that? Because that is another area that I believe needs to be addressed. And can I just ask you, Minister, I brought up to you about a year ago about the Danish. It's called co-housing. And it's a living solution where families get together, they build several small houses together in one plot of land with shared spaces as what they say is a communal laundry, cooking, a lounge. And I believe the statistics on this, and the Danish have a really good reports on this. Is there any way that we could look, particularly now for our housing that are homeless? That's huge. Is there any way that we could look at maybe something like that in the long-term picture? Because I think these are the units and these are the things that will happen going forward. But if just those few now, and thank you. Thanks, Minister.
Thank you, Senator. So in relation to homelessness and the difficulties that we're facing and that individuals are facing, there are a number of different layers to this. And so one of the things I said, I think, earlier on was that I've had an engagement with Minister Regina Doherty, and we have raised it at the interagency group that I set up in 2017. And it's also been raised in a special meeting that we had with the Taoiseach and relevant ministers about this issue of arrears and payments and people who are becoming at risk of having to enter emergency accommodation or present as homeless because they're not able to meet the bills. And is there an intervention that we can make, or a further intervention that we can make, that would help so much earlier in the timeline, that would keep that person in their home? And so that work is progressing at the moment, because I think it's an important part of it that gets missed sometimes. We focus on people who present to homelessness and people who enter into emergency accommodation. Of course we do. But there's a cohort behind that who are in difficulty today, and the rent is building up and they're not paying it. And they're going to find themselves later down that line unless we can step in. So myself and Minister Doherty are looking at that. I spoke about the income thresholds and the review that's happening already, so I won't go back over that. In terms of rent pressure zones, because we've changed the qualifying criteria for rent pressure zones to exclude the GDA, that will have an impact then, obviously, in those areas outside of the GDA. In relation to the Rebuilding Ireland Home Loan, to give you an update where we are at the moment, 92 million was drawn down to the end of 2018 and 145 million was drawn down to the end of April. Local authorities continue to accept, process and approve Rebuilding Ireland home loans, because we've told them that the funding that they need will be made available for those approvals that they've given. So that discussion on funding is almost complete. The Housing Finance Agency has an outstanding facility, so there's no issue there in relation to it being able to secure those funding once I have that final figure for them in relation to, or that next figure for them. And so the approvals and drawdowns are not contingent on this money. It's not even contingent on us going to a local authority and saying the money is there. They've been told to do what they're doing. And in relation to kind of co-housing, there's a lot of different concepts in the mix at the moment. And one of them is the concept that you spoke about, the Danish model. And there's another German model that's not too different from it. And we are progressing at the moment our own pilot project that will be similar but not exactly the same. And I'm just trying to tie the final pieces of it together. The key thing here in making it real is the delivery of the land for it. I don't think it's the willingness of the people to engage in, building homes. I don't think it's a problem from that point of view. It's not a problem from design, because we've got these models elsewhere and they look really great. So it's just to see what exactly we can deliver on a land point of view in the funding that we have around things like servicing sites and that kind of stuff. So there's a piece of work happening there. But yeah, I mean, you mentioned it before, so we are looking at it. Yeah.
Thanks, Minister.
Thank you.
Owen?
Thanks, Chair. And thanks, Minister, for the answers. I want to come back on 3 questions and then maybe just respond finally to some of your initial points. In relation to the inspections, will all emergency accommodation be inspected, or is it still just the voluntary sector accommodation be inspected? And when I say all, I mean the voluntary sector, the hubs and the private sector. In relation to gas boilers, I would urge you to go back and maybe look at the transcript from our committee here recently. What is happening with gas boilers is, as a percentage of the total number of boilers going into new builds, it may be declining, but because far more properties are currently being built, the actual number of new gas boilers coming into the system is substantially greater. And we're being told by industry that maybe as many as 60% of new builds currently have gas boilers. Now, the problem is that while it's not possible to phase out gas boilers today because of constraints in terms of expertise in the industry, unless there is a phased target date by which gas boilers have to be no longer used in new builds, then they're going to be used for much longer than is necessary. And then we're going to be here in 15 years' time having a conversation about where we get the money for the cost of retrofitting those. So I would just urge you to go back and relook at those near zero energy building guidelines regulations before you publish them, and see if it's possible to consider a target date for the ending of the installation of gas boilers new builds. My preference would be 2021, but nonetheless. And in relation to the
2021
for the phase out.
And 2021, no more gas boilers being
in new builds.
Okay.
That would be my preference, but the real issue is to have a date in those regulations by which they have to be out. In relation to the co-living, and maybe I didn't explain my question clear enough, so I'll go through it again because you didn't answer it. An institutional investor comes in, gets planning permission, builds a co-living facility as you described them, and it is inhabited by the kinds of people that you've been talking about may choose to live in that. Okay. At a later stage, another institutional investor may come along and purchase that entire block, not individual units, but may purchase the entire block. And it's at that point that many of us are concerned that, depending on what's happening in the market and what's the intention of that institutional investor, that it could go from providing relatively high-end, high-cost, short-term accommodation for emerging professionals to providing accommodation for very, very vulnerable people. And it could descend into tenement-type accommodation. So I suppose what I'm asking is because I don't hear anything as to how you would prevent that from happening. And is that not a concern, and do you not think that that's something that you should be looking at? And then just a couple of final points. Look, the Rebuilding Ireland target for new home completions is very clear. It's an average of €25,000 over the lifetime of the plan. Clearly that means you weren't going to get 25,000 in the first or the second years, but you'd have to hit 25,000 by the third and then exceed. You are behind. Now, you may catch up. Right? And we'll have to wait and see. But I think it would be more straightforward if you at least would admit you're behind and there's a lot of catching up to do. With relation to the legal definition of housing need, I can argue for whatever definition I choose to, and I can make the case. So I do not accept that people in receipt of HAP have their long-term social housing needs met. Yes, I accept it's a short-term benefit support. Yes, I accept that we will always need a housing benefit of that kind. But those people have a real long-term social housing need. And the best way to test whether the people in HAP would choose to remain in HAP or go for social housing is just put them back on the list. Let them make the choice themselves. Because the problem is the way the system has been set up under legislation, which we opposed, is that they don't have that choice in the same way as they would do if amendments to legislation were made in the way I'd like to do it. The last thing I'd say is this, Owen. You often try and deflect criticism by accusing us of personalising it, right? Personalising it if somehow I was making personal attacks on you and your character. Oh, and you're the minister. You're responsible. So when people come in here and criticise the things you do, It is because you are the minister and we don't think you're doing the job correctly. That's not personalising it, that's called holding you to account. And if you don't like it, that's fine. But I won't make any apologies for criticising either things you do or things you say, because I believe they're the wrong things to do. Of course you'll defend your actions, of course you'll defend your words, but to suggest that somehow we shouldn't criticise you, because somehow that doesn't play well with the voters, I'm sorry, I have a job to do here, and I'll continue to do it. And where you are doing things wrong or saying things that I think are inappropriate, I'll do my best to hold you to account, and I think the public will thank this committee for doing that into the future.
Minister.
Apologies. The last thing, some local authorities aren't accepting or processing new Rebuilding Ireland home loans. South Dublin isn't currently, just so you know.
Thanks, Chair. Deputy Owen, I never said you shouldn't criticise me. I never said that. Don't try and claim that you're not trying to personalise it to me when you spend more of your time producing massive posters and billboards with my face on them and driving them around town. Because
record, Minister.
Highlighting
your record.
That's not what you're doing. In fact,
it is what I'm doing. Read the billboards.
No, Deputy. So what you're actually engaged in is you are trying to, I suppose, personalise the crisis that we have in homelessness to me, rather than focusing on some of the things that are happening that are important improvements, or some of the changes that should be pursued. And even when I talk about why they can't be pursued, why they wouldn't work, why they'd have a displacement effect and actually could make things worse, you just ignore that. And you come back then and you try and dance on the pin of a head on the use of an individual word. No, you see, this is the problem now when you come up against facts, Deputy. They're quickly forgotten. And you go back to mantras that we've heard before. I had it in the Shannon last week with the rent bill. I had to make the same arguments again, even though I'd already made them in the previous week with the same representatives from your party, because you weren't listening or you just didn't like the facts. And I'm sorry if some of the facts are uncomfortable for you, but it is the case that we are making progress when it comes to the supply of new homes in Rebuilding Ireland. I believe that we are on target for the fundamental supply targets that we've set in terms of new homes available to use this year and in the following years. We're not building all of them ourselves, of course, so in reaching those targets it's about pulling the right levers, making the right changes in law and regulations to allow the sector to do more, and the sector is doing more as a result of those changes that we've made, but it's not an exact science. As I informed the committee earlier when you weren't here, I don't know if it was when you were out on radio rather than being in the Housing Committee, we're going to be in the range of 23,000 to 25,000 new homes this year, but I believe we'll hit 25,000 new homes, which is the target, but it's not an exact science. In relation to gas boilers, I understand the point that you're trying to make there, or that you are making. I don't want to say too much now because I am in discussions with Minister Bruton on his climate action plan. But certainly if we're going to have a target for phase out, we need to make sure that we have security of supply chain at the same time. So these are the things that are being discussed in detail in advance of that plan going to Cabinet in the next number of weeks. In relation to co-living, absolutely, any time we make a change in guidelines, we have to make sure that we aren't doing anything that's going to decrease standards or have a negative impact on people who might be more vulnerable. So at the moment, all of the improvements that we're making for standards, when you look at the rent bill that was recently passed, in terms of actually defining what a substantial improvement is and linking it to things like the BER rating, all of those things are very, very positive. The new inspectors that we're going to have with the RTB for enforcement, the increased inspections happening under Dublin City Council, we are seeing a great improvement in the stock of housing that's coming online. The social housing that's been built today. Social housing that's been built today is phenomenal. I mean, it is, as it should be. And so that's really, really important that we don't let standards slip. So just as we have with student accommodation, yes, with build to rent and with co-living, we are watching this very closely to make sure that there will not be any unintentional redirection of a type of accommodation into something that it shouldn't be used for. In relation to the Rebuilding Ireland home loan, every local authority has been informed to continue to accept, process and approve local authority loans. So please, if you have examples of someone being refused, so give me the email if you want to anonymise the name, that's no problem, so I can get on it and follow it up myself. But the fact that I haven't yet agreed or published a financial amount that will support these loans that are being approved doesn't mean that they can't be approved. Because, as I said, the Housing Finance Agency has a standing facility for the drawdown of loans. It's quite significant. You made your point on social housing needs assessment. I made my point. We won't go back over that. In relation to emergency accommodation, all emergency accommodation will be subject to the inspections and the standards in the framework. There is a complaint regime of process in place at the moment. I did discuss with the Ombudsperson improvements that might be made to that inspection or that complaints regime to make sure that someone does feel safe and comfortable making a complaint independent of the body or organisation who might be delivering the services, and site visits will commence next year to accommodation. We're going to go to everyone, all service providers, and everyone will have to be compliant with the quality standards framework from, I think, the middle of 2020. So that's what we're going to do. But what I did say is that the idea of an independent inspection, I think the quality standards framework are very good. I don't think that we should lend ourselves to a view that maybe things aren't happening that shouldn't be happening in emergency accommodation. And again, I had an engagement with the Ombudsperson on this to make sure that he was satisfied with certain things in the inspections that he did. But I'm not saying that we won't have an independent inspection regime in place. What I'm saying is we need to roll out the quality standards framework first, make sure that everyone's in compliant, and then see where we go from there.
Victor, I think, has a quick question there, and then I'll go to Richard, all right?
Three key points. Just action number 319. It relates to the publishing of the strategic development management plans prepared by each of the LAs, the local authorities. And this is in the Rebuilding Ireland. And you might just confirm, have all those plans been returned first and published? Now, there may be reasons, if you don't have that information now, not to worry, you might come back to us or supplementary or drop the committee a note. So that's action item 3.19. So it relates to the publishing of the strategic development management plan prepared by each local authority for its housing land. And have these been completed? But you might not have that information now. If you could follow up supplementary, I've no difficulty with that. I then refer to your statement here today, and you talk about it. One of the mechanisms available for the local authorities to help them deliver the affordable housing options is the Service Site Fund. 310 million is available to grant fund to 2021 for infrastructure. What is the situation there in terms of that? You might just update us on some more information. And then thirdly and final point, this morning in the Irish Times there was a story carried about a report that's to be published which is highly critical of the standards of maintenance in many of our local authorities. And of course this does have an impact, because then when these houses eventually become available, one, they shouldn't be at this low standard. It's not everywhere. I haven't seen the report, I've just read the report in today's Irish Times. But it also has the knock-on effect of turning these houses around again when they become available if they're in such a dire state. And I have been in some local authority houses in my own local authority that I'm amazed people even lived in them for the last 5 years prior to that. And a lot of this has contributed to the lack of maintenance of these houses and supports for the tenants in them. But as I say, you haven't seen the report yourself, I'm sure, Minister. I just would draw it to your attention, and perhaps someone may come back just on their comments in relation to same.
Senator, for those questions. Just on the last question that you asked, I didn't see the report, I'm afraid, because we were in committee first thing. But the plan is to move, as we finish our voids programme, which is coming to its conclusion, to move that money and that activity into maintenance. I think maintenance of social housing stock across the country really fell through the crisis years in a big way as resources were reduced for local authorities. We're now increasing resources for local authorities, increasing funding as well, but we'll be able to have, as we come through the voids programme, we'll be able to move that into a maintenance programme, which I think is very important because of the increase in social housing homes, that we have to maintain them. Of course we do, it's a person's home. And so state management in that regard will be very, very important, and we've hardwired that into all of the regeneration programmes that we have coming out. In relation to the Service Sites Fund, so 310 million was made available for the Service Sites Fund in budget 2019. 275 million from government exchequer, 35 million from local authorities. The breakdown of spending for that, as allocated, is 100 million in 2019, 142 million in 2020, 68 million in 2021. Now, it won't all be spent, if you like, in each of the years, but I have authority within my budget to carry forward money for the Service Sites Fund into subsequent years as I need to, because that's there to deliver at least 6,200 homes as part of that particular affordability pipeline, but it's not the only affordability pipeline that we have. Last year we commenced that relevant part of Part 5 in 2009 Act for the Service Sites Fund. We put the regs for the scheme of priority in March of this year. I said earlier, 26 of the 31 local authorities submitted their schemes to me. 10 have been approved by local authorities. I made the first call for funds for sites from local authorities in June of last year. We finalised 10 projects for 1,400 homes in December of last year, worth 43 million. We have the economic assessments from 20 local authorities now in, which happened, I think, towards the end of last year. I made a second call in April of this year, and so far from 15 local authorities, we've had 29 submissions worth about €90 million which will help support almost 2,000 new homes. So we will be giving sanction on those ones that were successful very, very shortly. So that's where we are with the Service Sites Fund at the moment. And in relation to Action 3.19 under the plan, this is ongoing. So we're, like in some areas, as we solve particular land issues, we're then able to update the live map that we have under Rebuilding Ireland as to what's happening with the use of land. Some areas we're more along the line of getting a proper picture of the land need. The Galway Task Force is going to do an important piece of work in that area. And then in other parts of the country, there's some land that's indebted. So it's local authority owned land that's indebted. And then we're looking at private land in terms of turnkeys that might actually be a cheaper way of, and a quicker way of getting social housing delivered in that area. So there are a few layers to this, if you like, in terms of assessing it. So it's ongoing. That's why it's in the orange, because we're constantly publishing and updating the website map. And when we have, I mean, certain areas have a very detailed plan already in place. And the Housing Agency has already done its LAGS piece of work as well within the time frame. As to publication of those individual plans, I'll check in with the section and see, but you know that we have the Housing Delivery Office in the department, which is basically week in, week out, looking at every local authority, what's been delivered, where's the land coming from, and doing that kind of future needs assessment for land for both local authorities, but also for housing bodies as well. So these regional workshops that are underway at the moment is about identifying the housing needs the land need, that housing bodies have, that local authorities might be able to meet, or indeed state land as well, the LDA.
But can you confirm, Minister, to wrap up on this, that they're all in? I mean, they were requested. It relates to there were to be published strategic development management plans. So they were to be prepared by each local authority, they were to be submitted, and the plan was to be published. So I suppose the first thing we need to ascertain, have they all 31 come in? Which ones are they? You mightn't have it today, you might send it on to us, like, which of these 31 are on? I'd like to see a list of them, and I'd also ask, what's the intention in terms of publishing this information?
Thanks, and I'll be more specific then. So the Housing Authority has finished its LAGS work, and I believe it's published it. All of the plans, from my understanding, as per the report here, were returned by the end of September 2017. But separate to that, local authorities are updating the Rebuilding Ireland land map. So they do that separate to the returning of plans. But what I might do is, I might get a detailed note, Senator, just to confirm, but and what we can do about the publishing of plans. But I think that local authorities believed they were meeting their reporting requirements by updating their land maps on the website on a quarterly basis.
That wasn't what you had envisaged.
So, well, I just want to be clear that we have that they didn't get a misinterpretation from our side, and I don't want to turn around and say they're not in compliance with this action.
I appreciate that.
If
but
they had a different
you might update
understanding.
the committee on it. You might send us
Absolutely,
a memo or a note on it.
Yeah, that's no problem. Thank you.
Richard.
Okay, Minister, I said credit where credit's due earlier on, so I'm more than capable of saying that. But I have to say, when it comes to dealing with the wider housing and homelessness emergency we have, I'm in despair at the failure of your policies. I'm truly in despair when it comes to my own area. It's just, it's an appalling vista, really, in terms of their failure. Next year, Dunleary-Rathdown County Council is at best going to deliver 6 new council houses. 6. Now, you have said it takes time, you can't do things overnight, but the situation is going to improve. And as we get nearer to the end line of Rebuilding Ireland, the output of directly provided council housing is going to ramp up relative to the reliance on the private sector. Okay? That's not happening in Dunleary-Rathdown. It's going in the other direction. 6 council houses. Now, I want an explanation for that. How you can possibly claim that that is a serious attempt to address the housing crisis in Dunleary, where it's just shocking. 6. There might be some AHBs. there may be some Part 5 and so on, but in terms of council housing output, 6 next year. That's down on what was produced this year, significantly down. And what was produced this year was pathetic compared to the demand. And please don't say, oh, that's the council's fault, it's not my fault, we're doing our best to put the pressure. It's a Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil council. Okay? Secondly, the HAPs, reliance on HAPs. I didn't hear your earlier response because I had to pop out for a minute. 70% of people who are on HAPs in Dún Laoghaire are paying top-ups. The national figure is 50. In Dún Laoghaire, it is 70%. It's absolutely shocking, and people paying hundreds over and above what they're supposed to pay. And doesn't that prove that HAPs is not equivalent to directly provided council or social housing? Because you've always claimed the two things are, you know, it's just different ways of delivering the same thing. But if 70% of people who are in HAPs have to pay top-ups, it's clearly not. It's not the same thing. It's a completely different thing, where you are prey to private landlords, to the extortionate rents that they are charging, and indeed the local authorities are now facilitating this extortion by these landlords by approving situations where these massive top-ups have to be paid. In some cases, even suggesting to people in this situation that they should maybe use their child benefit to make up the difference, which is what people are actually doing, right? So this is directly leading to the impoverishment of people and directly leading to money being taken away from children in the form of child benefit being used to make up the difference on HAPs. How can you excuse something I just discovered last night? We knew it was in the pipeline, but it's now an accomplished fact. That Dún Laoghaire DLR Properties, a corporate subsidiary of Dún Laoghaire County Council, yesterday completed the handover of a part of the Cherrywood, known as TC3, the sale of it, to Johnny Ronan, to a private developer.
From using individuals.
Okay, a private, well-known private developer. You know, one of the people who helped with the Celtic Tiger crash, now gaining control of a significant portion of the Cherrywood development in exchange for an office building, which the council will get and is going to generate revenue for the council, when what we need is housing. And it's just unbelievable that you would let that happen. And again, this is a Fine Gael, Fianna Fáil council. We oppose the setting up of that corporate subsidiary, believe that the democratically elected representatives of the council should make decisions about these sort of things, but this corporate subsidiary, dominated by Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael, can hand over a big, what's known as TC3, to a private property developer. It's not going to deliver any of the desperately needed affordable housing. It's just shocking. You said, I heard you say earlier on, that the standards of social housing must be, maintained, the quality of the social housing that's delivered. Again, let me just give you a news flash on what's actually happening. And this drives a coach and horses through your claimed social mix. You want integration of people from different income streams. In Coolanore, stroke Honey Park, okay, which is one of the biggest developments, it was NAMA, back in the hands of the private developers. We have just discovered, on foot of representations from the residents in the social housing element, the Part 5 element, that all of those houses that were for social housing were built to lower specifications than their private equivalent in the same development, right? That's housing apartheid. I mean, considerably. And they're now suffering the consequences in terms of noise pollution and so on between units. At every level, they were built to a lower specification. In other words, the attitude was, they're council tenants, we can give them less quality. How does that tally with the with your claimed aspiration for social mix, for putting people from different income brackets in together. Final question. For all of those people who can't even get on a council housing list because their incomes are just above or a little bit above the threshold, they are completely in no man's land, particularly in areas like mine. Right? Now, I have asked you repeatedly, when are you going to raise the income thresholds so that people who are being whacked off the list, often waiting 10, 12, 15 years because they get a job, they get a pay rise, they're trying to do well, they're not dependent on social welfare or whatever some people might have to be, they're working, and then they lose their 10, 15 years on the housing list, and this is happening every week, and I've asked you again and again, will you do something about this? And you're told, oh, we're looking at it, there's a review, there's this, that and the other, right? Those people, a whole generation of people who are working, are absolutely in no man's land. There's nothing for them, there's no affordable housing. They can't get on the council housing list, and it's just, nothing is happening. So what are you going to do about it?
Minister.
Thanks, Chair, and thanks, Deputy, for the question. Deputy, you talk about the failure of policy, but I'm not sure what policy proposal you're bringing forward as a silver bullet to the challenges that we face. What we require in housing is a number of different policies because it is a very complex area, and we have those. I think to pretend that you've got some radical different way of doing it that would actually have the support of the public, let alone the support of the House, is disingenuous. And Dún Laoghaire is a special case, I admit that. It's different to what's happening in other parts of the country. But where were you when I went out to the local authority there to talk to the councillors there about the challenges that are there in Dún Laoghaire? Outside protesting. I was inside the Democratic chamber trying to resolve issues and go through details. You were outside with a megaphone trying to drown out the meeting. What use is that? What use is that?
We've no choice.
Of course you have a choice. You're involved in the political democratic process. You've got to lean in and get involved and bring forward proposals and work with us. Or you can go outside and protest. But going outside and protest isn't going to house one extra person. I can guarantee you that. In relation to the specific questions that you've asked, so from 2018 to 2021, more than 1,500 new homes will come into the stock of social housing in Dún Laoghaire. In 2019, we'll see 650 coming into the stock of social housing. 192 homes were built last year. I don't know why you don't count Part 5 as social housing or housing bodies. These are homes that go to people on the housing list. They are social housing homes. You're wrong to not count them, and you're doing that from an ideological point of view, which I just don't understand. Dún Laoghaire Rathdown will deliver on its targets for this year. In terms of social housing needs, we've seen a drop in Dún Laoghaire. We saw them exceed their targets for last year. I was in 33 homes in Fitzgerald Park recently, which are fantastic homes. You talk about quality. When was the last time you were in a new build social housing home? They're built to fantastic standards. Great, so you saw...
I'm delighted to see those houses. They're about 10 years too late,
You've got a problem with those houses. You've got a problem with those houses, or the quality...
They're great.
So what are you complaining about when it comes to the quality of social housing? I mean, that's...
Interrupt the Minister. He didn't interrupt.
Sure, apologies.
Sorry, Deputy,
apologies.
please.
I spoke about the housing assistance payment at length earlier on. It is there to complement what we are doing in relation to build. Too much dependence on HAP today. That dependence will decrease, but there'll always be a reason and a need for HAP, because individuals like the flexibility that it offers in terms of where they can live, and from a social housing point of view and policy, it allows us to secure a mix of tenure in existing stock where we don't have it, or new stock as it's built, if that stock is apartments, for example. So it actually plays a very positive role from that perspective. In relation to the top-ups that you're talking about, those top-ups are being met by the local authority in many instances because we have given them that flexibility to do so. But where top-ups are being met by individuals and where it's putting them at risk of not being able to meet the bill or make other payments, first of all, the local authority is meant to do an assessment to make sure that that's not possible. But where it does happen, as I said earlier, we are looking at initiatives and interventions that we can make around arrears to make sure that they don't find themselves in housing insecurity because of the affordability of the place that they are living. And in relation to income thresholds, as I said earlier in previous contributions, the Housing Agency is looking at this. A review is underway. There are a number of social housing reforms that I want to make now that the stock is increasing. I hope I'll be able to bring them forward as one package so we can have one big discussion at the same time around differential rents, around other aspects of social housing policy, and we're working towards that. But in addition to that, for people who will not and will never qualify for social housing, even when the income thresholds are changed, if they are changed, This is why we have the affordability programme in place. This is why we are no longer saying as a government that we just have a social housing programme and if you qualify, there you go, but if not, good luck to you. We recognise that the views of citizens all over Europe and in many modern cities are changing in terms of what responsibility the state has in the provision of housing. It's no longer just social housing and emergency accommodation and nothing else. Actually, it's about looking after a middle group of people who might never be able to afford to live or rent near where they work, particularly in urban places, unless we make the interventions that we're making now. So we are responding. We responded with rent caps. We're now responding with affordable housing and cost rental, and we'll continue to respond with things around land, like we're doing with the Land Development Agency, so that in desirable areas where there is high demand, we can have mixed housing development.
Chair,
Yeah, let Victor in, then you can come back.
Chair, can I request just a comfort break at some point, because we've been here since...
Okay, do you want to take it now then?
One thing. How many questions have you got? One?
just a couple more supplementaries.
Okay, yeah.
Suspend for 5 minutes.
Suspend for 5 minutes.
Okay, yeah. Thanks.
Let's go to the news.
It speaks to your false suggestion that we don't put forward alternatives. And I think you used the term displacement, earlier on. Right? This is an example of displacement because We have been campaigning about that particular site in central Dún Laoghaire, saying it should be used to provide affordable and public housing for years, right?
Before it broke and became a big story in the last couple of weeks, we've been campaigning saying that particular site is perfect for public and affordable housing. It would revitalise Dún Laoghaire, which desperately needs families and so on living in the centre of it. But instead, it's going to a property developer who's just looking to maximise the profit they can squeeze out of that site for these boxes with fold-out beds that they will charge €1,300. And let me tell you, as a bit of local knowledge, because this has now become a national sort of debate around this site, I can tell you people are raging about this proposal right across Dún Laoghaire, from all sectors of Dún Laoghaire society. They're raging about it. It's an absolute abuse of the strategic housing development process, that you could bypass the normal planning process to do this. It's just shocking. But this is not meeting the housing needs of the area. Nobody asked for something like this. Right? They're asking for decent quality housing for families and individuals who cannot get anything because it is totally unaffordable in Dún Laoghaire, right? Where property prices are now, average property prices are in excess of 600,000, rents are well over 2,000 a month on average, and where there is virtually no public housing being provided, right? It's just shocking. And I would ask you, as I asked you last week, we put in an objection to this, but I would ask you to look at whether this is in fact a complete abuse of the strategic housing development sort of process, that something like this should be allowed under that. You didn't comment also on whether it is appropriate, whether it's something we should be doing in the current climate for local authorities which are under your remit to be exchanging land that could provide hundreds of housing units, desperately needed housing units, for office blocks in Cherrywood. Is that appropriate in the teeth of this crisis, that public land that could be used for housing is being given to private property developers? Because I think it is absolutely shockingly inappropriate in the teeth of it. So please comment on that. You also did not comment on the point I made about Part 5, right, in a particular example. Right now, I know you don't know the particular example, but if I'm correct, if my assertion is correct, that Part 5 social housing is built to lower specifications, to a lower standard and quality than private development in the same housing development, do you think that's acceptable? Because I think it is not acceptable, and it is housing apartheid. It's like saying there's two standards, there's two tiers of housing. I think that's totally unacceptable, and it's actually increasing the stigma and so on associated with social housing to do that. Please comment on that.
No, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Deputy, for those follow-up questions. So when it comes to co-living, I'm not going to talk about an individual planning application. I'm the Minister for Planning, and I have to be very, very careful here. I'll note that you didn't object to co-living as a concept at the time when it was introduced, and earlier today one of your colleagues, as well as Sinn Féin, welcomed the concept and supported the concept of co-living. It's one very small part of supply. Over the next 12 months, it'll make up probably less than 1% of the tens of thousands of new homes that will be built, and co-living is not a solution to the supply problem that we currently have today. In relation to your question about the office details, the building that Dún Laoghaire down and an exchange that it has made, I'm not across the details of that. So I will look at that and see what's happening, because we know that we have pressures around land for supply. I want as much land as I can get to me. That's why I created the LDA, the Land Development Agency, to get state land, more state land, for more housing. And so I will look and see what's happened there. But Deputy, I can't comment further because I'm not across the details. It's also important to say that, you know, we have to find a balance between autonomy at local level and control at central government level. I believe in local government reform. I believe in devolving more powers to local authorities, and I'm very glad that, for example, we had the plebiscite approved in Limerick. I was been speaking to councillors in your own area over the course of the weekend, people who were re-elected, giving out to me for taking too many powers away from either the executive or the elected people in Dún Laoghaire. So I have to give some degree of autonomy to the officials and the councillors there as to how they go about their business in the local authority area. It's not to say it's not my responsibility, it's to say that there is a balance between my role as Minister for Housing and their role as the relevant local authority. And we're trying to strike the right balance all the time. But whenever I go to do something that would, I believe, make things happen more quickly but involve removing powers, I get blamed about undermining local authorities. Then when I go to give more powers to local authorities and they don't use them as you might like them to, I then get blamed for not taking responsibility for local authorities. So let's find a balance here. And in relation to Part 5, I'm not aware of...
Corporate subsidiaries aren't.
I'm not aware of what you're talking about, the plan that you're talking about. What I did say earlier on is that the social housing that I have seen has been built to an exceptional standard, as it should be. And we're not falling back into some of the mistakes that were made in the past in terms of some of the stigmas that arose from social housing, in terms of the design or the planning or the forethought that is going into the building of new social housing homes, how they look, how they feel, what it's like for the family moving in, and the additional facilities that have been put in place of that. And that's why when I talk about housing more recently and the challenges that we face, because we know that supply is increasing, the challenge now becomes more of a planning one, making sure that we are building the right types of homes in the right types of places. And that is something that is absolutely crucial, not just in terms of meeting the current needs that we have in housing, but making sure that we're not making future mistakes today that will come back to bite us quite severely in times to come.
Minister, I want to personally thank Deputy Boyhan for raising the issue of the TC3. I was informed by a number of councillors from Dún Laoghaire last night that the Chief Executive had taken a decision to do a land swap. I don't want to get into too much of the detail, and I'm very conscious of what I'm saying. But I would ask you to look at the record of this committee. I raised this question a number of times, and the last time I raised, and I have the exact dates because I went to the trouble knowing this was to be a particular case, might I say from the outset, I always opposed the establishment of a company that was arm's length away from the councils, that they had no function. I'm reliably told by speaking to a number of councillors this morning that they had no hand, act or part in relation to the decision to dispose of this company. I then requested at the record of the House, at this particular committee, I requested that the Director of Local Government Auditing Services look at it. And the general view of having a company that was indebted, an insolvent company that was propped up constantly by the shareholders, which ultimately the council, and who is the agent on behalf of the shareholders, the Chief Executive in this case, and there is a board called DLR Properties. I also asked many months ago here about its zonings. I raised questions with the council as well. This site had the potential to build hundreds of apartments, hundreds of residential units. And I'm not suggesting they should all be social, I'm not suggesting they should be all affordable. I'm suggesting there could be an imaginative mix. It could be a mixed development of offices and things. This is in a strategic development zone, the second strategic development zone of this country, perhaps going to be one of the most, potentially could be one of the most successful because of its Lewis connectivity, because of the schools, because of the great infrastructure that was put in, front-loaded into this scheme. So what I'm really saying, Minister, I'm not asking you, dropping you into a situation here now, but what I would appeal to you again, because I'm on record of appealing on this and raising this issue, that you would talk to your Director of Local Government Auditing Service, that you would look at our qualified notes in relation to DLR Properties Limited, of which, even as much as our last report, which was 2017, she raises concerns about this company. They've continuously raised concerns. This company has been raised on a number of occasions in local government auditing reports. And to see, is this deal complete? We may be not able to do anything. Some weeks ago I asked that you would look into it, and the message would be conveyed to you that we would look into it. And we now have a situation where the councils will form, might I say, after the election, not before it, even though this has been an ongoing thing, for what is now a swap. But the bottom line is, these are public monies. This isn't a company that's rich in cash. This is a company that's indebted. This is taxpayers' money. And there's serious issues. So they're swapping a debt for another property. And I say, I don't want to go into too much detail about it because I'm conscious that this is a public meeting, but what I would appeal to you, Minister, is urgently to get a full briefing from the Chief Executive of Dún Laoghaire Rathdown, as I say, the background to it, the reasons, the debt that this company is exposed to. Forget about who it is. This is all debt guaranteed by Dún Laoghaire Rathdown County Council. And I'm not too sure if that's a satisfactory situation because, in effect, this is a company that's arm's length from the councils. This is an executive and a board. Okay, it's a limited company, so it's its own directors, of which there are councillors, to be fair on it, but they're not allowed to discuss any aspect of this business with the local authority. And I think there has to be a bell alarm ringing here today. Any companies that are at arm's length away, that are wholly owned by a local authority, and yet they're not accountable to the local authority, I think there are serious concerns. So what I would be saying, Minister, is would you just take a look at this TC3, see the background to it, and can I suggest, and I'm going to collaborate with a number of Oireachtas members today, that if it means bringing people into these committees, whatever committee is necessary, I think it should do. And I'm going to suggest to you that you'll have a number of PQs in a matter of days. There's outrage about this locally, and I think we need answers. And I'd appreciate if someone, if it's possible within the constraints of your ministry and the sensitivities around it, I'd like that we could have some sort of report on it. But I think look, there's a lot to be found out, there's a lot to be inquired into, but I'd ask you to use your offices to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Senator. So a lot of the issues that you touched upon there in relation to zonings, land disposal, the formation of companies by local authorities are functions that they have. And when I give a function, or when a local authority has a function that isn't removed, the Minister can't just step in and interfere, right?
Appreciate that.
But I get the concern that you're raising. I know that the Local Government and Audit Service has looked at the operation of these types of entities before. What I would suggest, Senator, if it might help in terms of being able to have a public engagement on this matter, if you wanted to raise it as a commencement order, we can speak about this specific project in as much detail as I'll be allowed to at the time. But it might help further some of the concerns that you've raised with me today. You know, I don't have the details of this in front of me, so I don't want to speak to it in too much detail. I'm just flagging the restrictions that I have in my own powers because of the autonomy that we do give to local authorities. But I'm happy to look into it in more detail in advance of us discussing it in the Shannon.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have just a few brief questions.
Sure. How dare you? How dare you?
No, it's just in relation, specifically around the turnkey developments that both the local authorities and approved housing bodies are purchasing. And I have some concerns that there's an over-reliance on it in specific areas. And I do that because I know in some locations in my own area where 100% of construction of housing is now being purchased for turnkey development by either approved housing bodies or indeed the local authority. And just concerned the implications that has on having houses available for the first-time buyers. And one of the other reasons I've been given for it is the lack of funding available to the contractors to finish out estates. And by the fact that that funding is not there, they're then looking towards the department as a quick solution as to finishing out the estates. And with that in mind, I know you established the 780 million fund for construction contractors who could apply for funding for smaller developments like I'm talking about. I'm just wondering what progress that is making. How many applications have been made? Have any been awarded into that capital fund for development?
Thanks.
Sorry.
Thanks, Chair. So in relation to turnkeys, and just if I can make a couple of initial points, first of all. So there's a kind of a misperception around what a turnkey is. People hear turnkey and they think, oh, the house is built as it's completed, and the local authorities come up and said, actually, I'll buy that, give us the keys. A turnkey, actually, in most instances, is where the land is vacant, it's not being developed at all, and it's not going to be developed, but for the fact the local authority has engaged and said, you have land there, it's in a preferable location for social housing delivery, so we will now agree with you the delivery of homes on that land, all the way through from that point there, through planning, through permission, through to construction. So they've actually, if it were not for the local authority engaging, nothing would be built there at all, in many instances. So turnkey doesn't mean it's completed and we've just come and got the keys. It actually means, you know, but it's a confusion that sometimes that the word turnkey doesn't reflect what it actually is. And so when we have the public debate on this, people in their heads think we're just stepping in front of the buyer and taking the keys. That's not what's happening. What it allows us to do as well is provide social housing homes in areas where we don't have the land in the right area, which is really important. And what we have said to local authorities is don't compete with first-time buyers. So, you know, where it's an individual house on a road, which is an acquisition, not a turnkey, and there is an engagement from a first-time buyer, the local authority is to back off. Where it is a significant number of homes where we mightn't have engaged before planning was even, or before construction commenced, local authorities and, you know, are told to back off. So we're trying to manage this as best we can. Turnkeys are useful because it's land in areas where we mightn't have land. It can also be more efficient. And we need to make sure that we're providing social housing in the right places. So it does have an important function. In terms of the overall bill that happened last year, there wasn't an over-reliance nationally on turnkeys. But in some areas, there would have been more than others because of that's how the market was working. That's because of what we needed to do. So, it's a very important part of delivery. And the only real difference between it and what might be considered local authority build is that it's not happening on local authority land. It's the land situation. They have the land. It's in an area we want it for. Maybe they've already serviced it so it can move quite quickly. Maybe they already have planning so we can move quite quickly. And that's why we go with the turnkeys. And then on the second question you asked in relation to Home Building Finance Ireland, that's operational as of the beginning of this year. And it doesn't come under me, but I understand that there'll be a report in July on the first 6 months of its operation that will go into the number of loans that have been approved, drawdown and everything else.
Okay, just one quick other thing I've been asked, just in relation to an update on the Syria legislation, where that is.
Thanks. Yeah, we had obviously the feedback from the committee, which I think was 12 months ago now, I think, Chair. And I've engaged with the CIF and other bodies on this. We want to get moving on this, I think, before we rise for the summer in terms of publication of, and I'm just being informed now that it's the autumn. We want to do this, we're going to do this, and it'll be the autumn session which will be addressing it.
Okay. And just a final point, and it's just in relation to the table. I think the colours have now got mixed up with the descriptions, and some things are ongoing and on schedule. And this is this famous report that we get. It's just a technicality, like ongoing, on schedule, on time, and the colours are all the same at this stage, and the descriptions are the same. And one thing I would suggest, if it's completed, there's no need to print it again. Maybe you could just take it off, because it's 42 pages. You know,
I get it in A3 as well.
Yeah, well, you can see that green is ongoing, on schedule, completed. Brown is sometimes ongoing, on schedule.
Of course, though, if we took out all the greens, you'd say there's nothing but red and orange there.
That's the objective.
We're not completely stupid, Chair. Fairness, come on.
Anyway, just an observation that's been made.
Noted.
I think we've concluded the meeting today. Can I thank the Minister and indeed their officials for their patience today, and it has been a fairly long but intense meeting, and to thank them for attending and engaging with the committee. We look forward to meeting you again shortly. This meeting is now adjourned, and the next meeting of the Joint Committee will be held on Wednesday the 12th of June at 9:30 on the motion of family and child homelessness. Thank you all very much.